Chapter 2044. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 2044. Third party. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2044. Third party. Anna wanted to give Lionel an answer that could satisfy him. An answer that would sweep away all of his worries and lift the veil of darkness from him. She wanted nothing more than to put a smile on his face, but the question was simply far too difficult. But what Lionel said after hearing her answer swept away all of her hesitation and disappointment in herself, replacing it with shock and a beating heart that refused to calm. I don't know if it's an illusion, but I feel that I know the answer for me all too well. I would be exactly the same person, just as lazy, just as unmotivated, entirely unable to take the world seriously. No matter how many variables changed, no matter the sequence of events, no matter what twists and turns came, there would only be two constants: my personality and my love of you. But now I'm confused. I always believed that this feeling was like a guiding lamp everyone had, but as I grew up, I realized that not everyone had that same conviction. I chose to ignore it, as I usually did, because I can never be bothered to waste time thinking about things I know I can't find the answer to. But then came the metamorphosis, and I gained a new understanding. The first time I heard the words, I was entirely stumped. It felt as though someone had gripped my shoulders and was shaking me violently, wanting me to wake up. The future can affect the past, they said. This chapter upload first at NVUSB. C0M. But if that was the case, why was I the only one that felt it? I don't have a time-related ability index, so the future should be just as blurry to me as it is to everyone else, but that nagging feeling remained. And now, I don't know anymore if that nagging feeling is even real. That light that had always been guiding me, that path I had always followed because I felt that I was at least being my true self, feels like a facade, a fabrication that was never real to begin with. I don't know what to think of it. I don't know what would happen if I suddenly started ignoring that path forward and took a step off of it. Lionel's face was placid as he spoke. Despite the weight of his words, it didn't seem to carry to his expression in the slightest. It was as though he had entirely dissociated, observing himself, or what he had thought to be himself, through a lens as a third party. He didn't even trust himself anymore. In his mind, where there had once been two constants, there was just one, and that one was Anna. Funny enough, Anna's worries weren't unwarranted. Not long ago, Lionel had thought about what these urges meant. This tug he had always felt. What did it represent exactly? But then he remembered that he had not just one tug, but two of them. He wondered if he should stop associating himself with Anna as well. Was his love for her real? Or was that something that had been programmed into him? And his personality? Was that casual indifference he always felt in so many things truly himself? Or was it just useful for this simulation if he were to act in this way? Maybe he just happened to have an ability index that also made him more aware of it than others. I think you should take a look at. However, in the end he couldn't bring himself to do it. If he gave up on Anna as well, what good was living anymore? He couldn't trust his own likes and dislikes. He couldn't follow his dreams because it was all meaningless. If he also didn't have Anna, why did he even have to bother anymore? His previous confidence in being able to enter the real world and rub elbows with them had vanished in a puff of smoke. Hadn't he been able to enter zones just as easily as well? Didn't those people feel very real and very alive? What good was it for him to hold on to this as though it was truly some sort of saving grace? Anna listened in silence, gripping Lionel's hand hard. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. The leaps in logic Lionel had taken to gain his current understanding of the world were only things in existence with millions of minds like himself could do. It was simply impossible for anyone else to succeed in such a thing. Although he had laid out so much, Anna still hadn't made the final conclusion. Doesn't the fact you can take a step off of it mean something? Anna said softly. Lionel's pupils trembled as he looked down toward Anna. I am very afraid, Lionel. I have heard many things about those with exceptionally high dream force affinity. Things that I don't want to believe. I'm very happy that you're saying so much. You rarely speak so much in a single breath, but it's also because of that I'm so worried. I want you to remember that dream force is nothing but a vessel, a conduit. It's a projection of what a person could be, but it isn't a person. Just because you can use dream force doesn't mean you can create life. It only means that you can grant the capacity for it. Aina didn't understand what was going on, but her best deduction was that Lionel's dream force affinity had grown so deep that he was beginning to see past the layers of what it meant to be human, and as a result, he was questioning many things. While she didn't understand fully, when it came to comprehension, and especially comprehension of her own body, Aina was far beyond anyone else. As a result, how could she not fully understand the role that dream force played in her own body? Of course, her deductions were entirely wrong. This wasn't what was causing Lionel's breakdown at all. But even so, hearing these words, Lionel felt like he had been hit by a speeding truck. "Fuse with me," Aina said lightly. "We haven't done it in a while." Aina reached out, and Lionel subconsciously deployed his dream world. Chapter 2045. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 2045. Idiot, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2045. Idiot. Lionel felt as though a bomb had just gone off in his mind. When his vision cleared, he felt like he was standing within Aina's body, experiencing what she was experiencing, feeling what she was feeling. It had indeed been a long time since they had done this. Since then, Lionel had improved greatly. Not only had his dream force manipulation stepped to an all-new stage, but he had also gained the ability to disassociate his soul from his body, granting him a great deal of strength in this aspect. As a result, when he touched his own dream world with Aina's mind, the connection was far deeper than it had ever been before. If before Aina had only been able to share a small portion, now it felt like she could share 110% of the aspects of her ability index. Now Lionel could truly feel what she felt, that instinct toward her body, and since they were connected, his own as well. He realized that Aina had even unknowingly already entered Tier 9 of the 6th dimension, and she was on pace to cross into the 7th dimension long before himself. However, he suddenly came to a stop. That was because he could sense that Aina's soul was under a great deal of strain. He immediately pulled back and sealed away most of his mind's strength. Just now he had been far too rash. He had continued thinking at his normal speed. And because he was using Aina as a proxy to take on the benefits of her ability index, all of the stamina drain was on her to withstand. If he had continued for a few more seconds, she might have collapsed and even fallen into a coma. This time he only allowed a single one of his minds forward, leaving all the other ones to focus on his body. But in reality, he had seen all he needed to see. He felt a shuddering change within him as his comprehension of dream force grew even deeper. His mistake was in assuming that dream force was just like other forces. Take water force for example. Not only did it make up the various bodies of water in the world, but the shifts and changes within. The ocean, as an example, wasn't just one type of water force, but rather an amalgamation of all the water forces in various quantities, almost like neutral force, which was a fusion of all forces in existence. Lionel had always viewed dream force in this way, an amalgamation of all kinds of dream force, and depending on the type of person you were, one kind of dream force would be more pronounced than another. However, he was entirely wrong. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. There weren't different kinds of dream forces, there was only one kind, the purest kind, the only kind in existence and the kind everyone shared. This was what separated dream force from other kinds of forces. In fact, it could be said that the other forces that made up the human body were more likely to impact your personality than dream force itself. Dream force was purely a vessel that allowed consciousness to exist, while soul force was what held the tainted colors of your personality. Lionel had always believed that dream force was a derivative of soul force, or more accurately a purified version of it. But it was more accurate to think of soul force like an impure dream force. It was a subtle difference in order, and yet it made all the difference in his mind. Suddenly, crack! Lionel's body trembled, and his gaze became vacant. Aina, who was allowing Lionel to explore and confirm the things she said, suddenly felt her expression change. She looked toward Lionel, shuddering at his dull gaze. Lionel's aura seemed to have entirely changed. At that moment, the universe resounded with a harrowing crack, It was a sound that every soul in existence heard, no matter where they were, no matter where they hid, no matter who they were. However, it seemed impossible to tell where this crack had come from. I think you should take a look at Aina felt her shoulders trembling as she looked into Lionel's eyes. She suddenly felt both an endlessly far away and endlessly close feeling. She wanted to take a step back, and yet jump into his arms at the same time. It was an absolutely suffocating feeling, so all she could do was stand in place. Lionel? Lionel? The dull gaze in Lionel's eyes seemed to snap into focus. He looked around and then down at Aina, and then seemed to be stunned for a moment. His gaze suddenly became incomparably gentle, so gentle that Aina felt that she might melt. But to her surprise, tears began to stream down Lionel's face at the same time. It was a moment that was difficult to describe. The aura exuding from Lionel was incomparably majestic, incomparably lofty, and yet the look in his eyes could put a newborn at ease, while his tears could make the same newborn burst into their own. Lionel suddenly looked away, his tears vanishing under a mysterious sort of power that Aina couldn't even begin to understand. I see. It seems that even this one has been a failure. I guess there are just some things that you can't change. Lionel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his dignified aura had reached his eyes. The air around him trembled and seemed about to collapse at any moment, but although Aina wasn't sure if it was an illusion or not, it felt that it was also quickly becoming weaker. Aina. Yes. Aina answered almost too hurriedly. She was nervous for reasons she didn't know why. For some reason it felt like she was meeting Lionel for the first time all over again. I'm an idiot that doesn't deserve you. No matter what state I'm in a month from now, promise to never leave my side, okay? Aina's lips parted, but she didn't know how to respond. In the end, she simply nodded, her face holding on to a strong determination. Lionel didn't meet Aina's eyes again, almost as though he couldn't bear to, or maybe he was too embarrassed to. This version of himself was truly far too weak, whether in fist or in mind. All the calculations in the world, and it's still not enough. But at that moment, Lionel smiled. It was a handsome, unrestrained smile, the kind that came from the bottom of his heart. Even I cannot play with lives so casually. Lionel laughed. He laughed so heartily. A laugh filled with relief. It was completely contradictory, especially since he said he had just failed, and yet he was so happy. He had never been happier in his life. Take care of this idiot, Lionel said finally. One day I won't disappoint you. Aina could only be confused as the suffocating aura suddenly vanished and Lionel collapsed. She hurriedly rushed forward to catch him, but even in this state, the smile on his face hadn't vanished. Chapter 2046. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 2046. Are you? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2046. Are you? Aina didn't have the words to describe what she was thinking about or how she was feeling. Any other person would have probably thought that their boyfriend had entirely lost his mind. He spoke about himself practically in the third person just now, as though the him she was looking at wasn't him at all. But also, just now Lionel's mind had been connected with her own. And yet, despite that connection, he had never felt farther away from her than he had in that moment. It was as though she was a small water spout, and he was a vast endless ocean. Although she was feeding into him, she was hardly helping or changing anything at all, and what he had to offer was far too vast for him to be able to share anything without risking her destruction. Aina trembled. Something similar had happened before, although not exactly in this way. Maybe, in fact, it had happened 2 times before. Once when Lionel suddenly cleared more than 70 floors of the Void Tower when he should have had no capability of doing so. And second when his father had appeared suddenly in the Rapak's nest and undid some kind of seal. But how were those 2 things related at all? This chapter upload first at NVUSB. C0M. This sort of unfathomable feeling. Aina hadn't sensed it when she met Lionel's father. In her opinion, Lionel's father wasn't even half as strong as the Lionel who just spoke with her. And maybe even that wasn't anywhere near exaggerated enough. So how could Velasco be the one who had sealed Lionel? It had seemed as though, back then, that he had done something for Lionel's own good. But the Lionel that she had seen just now was beyond the capability of anyone to seal. And setting that matter aside, why did it sound like he had come from a far-off land? Why did it feel like he had experienced so much, hurt so much? But what she was most interested in knowing was why was it that he was so happy about his failure? It felt like she was looking through a mirror. On one side there was the Lionel who was still looking for his answers, and on the other side, it seemed that there was another Lionel who had finally gained his answer. Both were the same man, maybe weak in their own ways, strong in others, but still pursuing after the same matter. Aina couldn't fathom just how much hardship this elder Lionel had to go through to finally find the answer, but she had never heard Lionel laugh so heartily and happily, as though he was finally free, finally resolute in his path. Aina held Lionel up, her palm gently resting on his cheek, her mind unreadable. Although there was worry between her brows, there was still a light smile on her lips. She felt that even this older Lionel was an idiot too. How could she ever leave him? Lionel's gaze suddenly snapped open minutes later. He sat up so quickly that his head almost smashed into Aina's, but he managed to weave out of the way just in time. His breathing was slightly labored, and he looked around in confusion. He distinctly remembered the last time he had felt a similar feeling, but there was something odd. The situation wasn't exactly the same. He couldn't remember anything that had happened in the Void Tower, but this time he felt like he could vaguely recall something. I think you should take a look at Lionel looked down at his hands, his pupils constricting. His dream force was nothing like he remembered it. A tenfold increase wasn't enough to describe it. Although his force manipulation remained the same, his ethereal glabella had become like its own innate node, so large that it had basically replaced the entirety of his frontal lobe, and it even looked as though it was eager to replace his entire brain. If his dream force output was 1 unit before, it was over 1,000 now. It had gone from a drop of water to an overflowing bucket, but he couldn't quite understand why. It didn't feel like his affinity had changed much, it was still outstanding. Or maybe it had grown to a point where he couldn't even differentiate any longer. The most obvious change was that his number of split minds had gone from a factor of millions to billions. In fact, it was even approaching 10 digits rather than just 9. Lionel realized all of this looking at his hands, because right now he wasn't observing his hands at all. Rather, it felt like he was looking at the individual cells that made it up. It was akin to the difference between observing a planet through a telescope and then zooming in to see the peaks and valleys, not to mention the populations that called it home. He was having a hard time wrapping his head around this matter, and he couldn't help but think back to what had happened in the Rapak's nest. Back then, his dream force affinity had gotten a huge boost. This time his dream force quantity had gotten its own huge boost. If he had had this much dream force when he was creating his army of stingrays, rather than an entire 3 days to outfit them, even a quarter of a day might be over-exaggerating the time he would need. And that was only taking into account little Tali's own limitations. The gap was simply as vast as an ocean. When this was simultaneously matched with the improvement of his dream force before this odd change, then the gap was overwhelming. In fact, Lionel wondered if this change was triggered by the improvement to his force manipulation or not, but it seemed unlikely. This hadn't happened with his Scarlet Star Force when he had improved it, so why now? How do you feel? Are you okay? Aina's question suddenly snapped Lionel out of his thoughts. When he looked toward her this time, he couldn't help but feel she was even more beautiful now than he remembered. Chapter 2047. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 2047. Mini vacation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2047 mini vacation. Lionel suddenly kissed Aina, catching her off guard. She hadn't been prepared for this sudden change as she was still worried about Lionel, and if he was doing okay, so she was far too stunned even to fight back. Eventually, she regained her bearings and bit at Lionel's lips. Ow ow, what are you doing to your husband? Lionel pouted. There are people watching, behave yourself. Aina chided. Even so, she couldn't help but lick her lips. The taste of Lionel's blood was truly great. If it wasn't because she felt that it was too weird to ask, she would take a taste more often. Lionel, though, had noticed the subtle, seductive action. He didn't know why, but watching Aina lick at his blood like that made a fire light within him. It was as though some repressed fantasies about being with a vampire empress were all resurfacing at once. What are you looking at? Aina asked to hide her embarrassment. Lick your lips again, slower this time. I really want to imprint it into my memories. Take another bite out of my lip if you have to. Aina was stunned speechless before she hit Lionel on the chest. Be serious. I am deadly serious. Come, take another bite. I'm ignoring you. Aina stood in a huff, dropping Lionel to the ground, but when she turned back, her lips couldn't help but bloom into a bright smile. If Lionel was willing to joke around like this, he was at least feeling better for now. She felt two arms wrap around her waist, a soft cheek pressing against her own. This time, she didn't fight back, her palm reaching up to touch Lionel's face. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0M look at you still as smooth as a baby's butt. Lionel was aghast. How could you poke at your husband's insecurities like this? Aina laughed, allowing Lionel a nice view of her bouncing chest over her shoulder. He couldn't help but shake his head. If only those perverts didn't set up cameras everywhere. What were those old perverts thinking? If the Morales ancestors knew what Lionel was thinking, they too would have probably been stunned speechless. How was this their fault? It was just the way things had always been done. The two continued to joke around without a care in the world, forgetting the time for a moment, and just enjoying one another's company. Finally, Aina asked the question that had been on her mind all the while. Are you really okay? You know you can talk to me, right? Lionel smiled. Maybe. At the very least, it's not enough for me to stress over it like I have before. Questions about life and its meaning. They're things everyone has, right? Why should I be the one to gain answers before anyone else? After seeing Aina's dream force, Lionel understood that it wasn't something that could just breathe life into things. One couldn't create life with it, and one wouldn't be able to manipulate the personality of another with it either. Of course, that didn't mean that there wouldn't be other ways of doing so. For example, giving someone certain affinities, or tainting their soul force with certain aspects, both were viable options. So, that didn't mean that Lionel's worries were entirely unfounded. I think you should take a look at, but what it did mean was that there was a path to true freedom. It existed, and it existed within every single person equally. That sort of realization was beautiful enough in its own right. As for what was beyond, it was still exactly that. Beyond him. If everyone had the same dream force acting as the foundation of their life, though, then Lionel was right back to square one. How could one possibly differentiate the value of a life? In fact, now that he thought about it, if it was so easy to just create people, what was the point of this simulation? If the point was to have predictive models of the future, and use it to avoid catastrophes, that was still acceptable. It made sense for this simulation to exist. But if the creators of this simulation were looking for existences that could help them out of their plight, then that went a long way to addressing Lionel's worries. As for why, one only had to ask themselves a simple question. If it was so easy to create life, why bother creating such weak life forms? If they needed help, why not directly create the most powerful existences they could? Or if they were worried about rebellion, why not just directly create the most powerful existences that could be safely controlled? The answer was obvious. It wasn't that easy to create life. Maybe he was still being manipulated, but keeping the chains on him wasn't so easy. And as long as there was a chance, he was certain that he'd be able to break free. Lionel rose to his feet. He was sure that this dimensional verse, along with the others, had been created for the latter reason. If it was for the purpose of simulating the future, there would have been no point in allowing a connection to exist between the universes, but those connections very much existed, the tribulation likely only being just one of them. Where are you going? Aina asked. You mean where are we going? Lionel corrected with a grin. Aina smiled. Okay, I'll bite. Where are we going? To end these air wars, of course. This piece of shit competition actually gave me a midlife crisis 3 decades early. I can't stand for it. Aina sputtered with laughter. Don't be reckless, we still need to plan things. If James wasn't out there being a lazy ass, I'll be okay. talking behind my back when you've just been smooching on my sister-in-law while all of us did free labor. Let's revolt, everyone. This king is too much of a bastard. Lionel grinned hearing James' voice. How could he not have noticed him already? The others had been worried after not receiving Lionel's orders for so long, especially after they had already gathered so many materials without seeing a peep from him, so they had come here. Who would have thought that he was taking a little vacation in an underwater resort? James threw something over and Lionel caught it. After a look, Lionel's grin widened. It was precisely what they needed to conquer the final sea. Chapter 2048. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 37 seconds p.m. Chapter 2048. Small knot. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2048 Small knot. Lionel tossed the glass orbs in his hand. Let's go, it's about time we stop preparing. Now's the time to end then. I'm quite tired of this game. The gaze of James and the others flashed. However, they simply nodded. Since Lionel had said so, that was how it would be. The first thing Lionel did was finish setting up a network of outposts. Since outposts of different cities couldn't be connected, the best way to deal with this was to spawn separate outposts of differing cities near one another. Like this, it would be relatively easier to shift from one city to the next. Then, Lionel commanded the Oryx and the Skies family to make their way to the fourth and final sea. At the same time, he sent a message to the Cloud Race. It was about time he made a move with them. He had wanted to save the Cloud Race for the perfect moment. They had played their role well enough. There were most definitely spies from the other continent present by now. And thanks to them, pressure that would have been on Lionel was greatly weakened. Now it was time to make true use of them. When Lionel entered the fourth sea, his internal sight trembled. The range he had once had was just 10 kilometers while he could barely deploy his dream world for about 100 or so meters. But now, there was easily 100-fold increase. The suppression of this world couldn't bind him as well as it could in the past. He could easily see 1,000 kilometers in every direction. Although this wasn't enough to cover the entire moon, it was definitely enough to cover over 50% of this sea. Thanks to this, Lionel was immediately able to see that this sea was already occupied by someone else, and they were just a small measure away from forming an air-grade territory and claiming it for themselves. This chapter upload first at Novel USB. C0 resemblance with the Aquarius family. But Lionel had already dealt with the Aquarius family, so that could only mean that this was related with Vega, and thus Adderworth. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Did he want to clash with First Nova right this moment? Or did he want to wait instead? Despite his words, he knew that he couldn't just casually bulldoze through the air wars right this moment. At the same time, victory was important for more reasons than just Aina's happiness. He still couldn't allow Third Nova to get his way. If Third Nova was truly connected to the Three-Finger Cult, then that also meant that he was connected to whatever schemes that cult was drawing up. Lionel had already deduced that the demonness and king had to come from the real world, so the stakes of this matter were still the same. When he had thought that he was being controlled every step of the way, he couldn't be bothered to care about this and didn't even want to continue to participate. But now that he was participating, he most definitely had to crush Third Nova's chances. However, after a moment, Lionel's gaze flashed with a decisive light. Now wasn't the time for taking a step back. It was about time that he went all out. Let me, Aina suddenly said. I think you should take a look at. Lionel looked over toward Aina. He remembered that Aina had a small relationship with Vega. In the past, Vega had wanted to choose Aina as her successor to the faction after she was promoted to the Void Senate. Back then, Vega had even been willing to use Lionel's health as a bargaining chip. This had occurred just after Lionel had cleared past the 70th floor and returned unconscious and heavily injured. It also happened to be around this time that Fourth Nova tried to sign Aina to a slave contract. If one were comparing pettiness, Aina was probably even more petty and ruthless than even Lionel. It seemed that after all this time, Aina hadn't forgotten about this matter, which was actually quite amusing to Lionel. That was because Vega hadn't even forced her hand. She was just negotiating from a strong position. But to Aina, she didn't take anything related to Lionel's life lightly. Before Lionel could even say anything, Aina had already taken out her battle axe. In truth, not many had seen Aina battle with her full strength. This was because although she was a beauty, she wasn't a queen beauty, and Lionel had gotten far more attention than her. So when they split, most chose to focus on him instead. However, after her feat of concocting a life-grade force pill, it could be said that very few paid more attention to anyone else. Lionel smiled. His demeanor seemed far more relaxed than it had in the past. Aina could tell that Lionel had somehow become even more like himself. That same, casual laziness was there and prominent once again. Now though Aina felt like she understood where it was coming from. Not long ago, she had spoken to what seemed to be a future version of Lionel. Just like everyone else, she was also aware of the fact that the future could affect the past. And if Lionel's future self was as powerful as he seemed to be, how could his current self not be completely and entirely bored of everything he came across? There was no challenge that could speed up his heart, no obstacle that he would feel was too great. In that case, as his future wife, if she was meant to keep her promise to stay by his side, then her one and only goal was to stay powerful enough that she could do just that. Vega was a reminder of a time where she had been too weak to do exactly that, and she very much didn't like it. Although she had no hatred for Vega, this small dislike was enough for her to draw her blade. It was her time to untie this small knot in her heart. 2. Chapter 2049. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2049. Fluttering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2049. Fluttering. The seas rumbled as the light of dusk grew lower and lower. First Nova had split his forces into two, trusting Vega to command the seas while he charged forth on land. As a result, they had done quite well. Although Third Nova believed that he was in the best position, relying on Orinik to take over the seas for him, his plans had been crushed by Lionel. Due to this, First Nova suddenly found himself to be in the best position. Vega was, obviously, under quite a lot of pressure from her family. She had actually suddenly decided to abandon her responsibilities and join a man of the Morales family. It might have been fine under normal circumstances since Adderworth was indeed outstanding. However, given the weight of these matters and the political weight behind them, her choice was truly much harder than it seemed on the surface. Her actions were akin to willingly standing on the side of a man who might very well soon take over a family that had the spears of the whole human domain pointed at it. This was a choice that took a great deal of courage. She might never be able to return to her family again. There was no doubt that in order for her to do this, her love for First Nova was not shallow, and the amount of effort she had put into making certain that he would succeed was not a small amount. Not only had she formed a gold-grade special ocean territory, but she was just a step away from being prepared to challenge the air grade. However, just when she felt that she was about half a day or so away from her preparations being complete, her gaze flickered as she was alerted to a large movement on her territory map. When she checked, her brows furrowed. There was an army of about 1 million moving toward her direction. This chapter upload first at Novel USB. C0 million would have been a large number during the first few days of the air wars, but 1 million now was nothing more than a drop in the bucket. Just the number of individuals she had scouting out her territory, and clear dungeons, and the like exceeded this number. Even so, Vega wasn't a fool. Anyone who could make it to this point wasn't an easy opponent to deal with. There was no longer any fodder remaining in the air wars. They had all been wiped out in the first few days. Now all that remained was the cream of the crop. Vega calmed, and the first thing she did was alert Adderworth. Then she gave out a series of commands. Lionel nodded toward Aina and allowed her to take the helm. Since she wanted to act, he didn't mind. Maybe before all of these things happened, he would have insisted on taking the most efficient route properly. He had been in a serious state since the start of these air wars, and he was meticulous about every detail. But right this moment, he felt more relaxed than anything else. It was difficult for him to take anything too seriously right now. It was as though the entire world was in the palm of his hand. Even if something didn't go absolutely perfectly, he could just slide the misplaced levers back into place, adjusting for victory regardless of the circumstances. When they finally crossed into the territory, Lionel's gaze flickered. Harsh winds kicked up, and they began to come across large numbers of whirlpools. The closer they got, the more numerous and dangerous these whirlpools began. The stingrays, whose numbers were no more than a drop in the bucket given the size of the ocean, had no choice but to split up to continue avoiding these whirlpools. I think you should take a look at Lionel realized immediately that this had to be something related to a special ocean territory, and this one used natural disasters of the water. If it was anything like the Lotus territory, then they would also have to be prepared for the possibility of one-time, large-scale attacks that could be levied in exchange for a large number of points. The good news was that most of his army was made up of oceanic creatures, but that didn't mean that they were immune from these disasters. If their formations were forced to become too small, then their armors would become less useful. Interesting. At that moment, Lionel finally spotted the city in the distance. It was in the gold grade, as he had expected. However, other than this, it was quite unique. It floated upon a thick, gray cloud that rumbled from time to time. This cloud was at least 10 or so meters above the surface of the ocean, and beneath it was an enormous whirlpool that rotated like the blades of a saw. Just looking at it, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but flicker. He knew immediately that the stingrays couldn't even get close to the city, at least not through the water. The defenses of this city were quite exceptional. If the balance is proper, since this territory has so many powerful areas of effectabilities, the odds that it has other powerful upgrades is minimal. It's a lot like the Water Lotus territory in this regard. At that moment, a beauty with fluttering blue hair appeared on the city walls. Although there were many others as well, it was simply too difficult to ignore her. When she looked down and saw Lionel and the others, her gaze couldn't help but flicker. Of all those she had expected, Lionel and Aina were definitely among the last. Soon, her expression returned to normal, and she waved a hand. At that moment, several ballista units on the wall took aim. Lionel's army was already greatly spread out. Due to the whirlpools, the largest group gathered in any one location was only a few hundred in number. At the same time, there was much room to maneuver. While on the one hand, this made it more difficult for a scattershot to cause a lot of damage. On the other, it made it easier to target more powerful threats. However, Lionel didn't do anything as he fell into silence. At that instant, a vortex of volatile, swirling energy appeared to his side. As for Aina, who had just been in that exact location, she had completely disappeared. When she appeared again, she had already appeared above the city, her speed so fast it might as well have been teleportation. She raised her axe into the skies, her hair fluttering wildly as she swung down. Chapter 2050. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 2050. Raging River. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2050. Raging River. Aina's axe left a bloody trail in the skies. It felt as though it couldn't be stopped, carrying a momentum behind it that seemed to encompass the auras of a myriad of weapons. Lionel had long since known that Aina had chosen her own path. While Lionel had first begun with calligraphy, before moving on to music, then painting, before finally having some accomplishment in translating his spear skill into force arts, Aina took a different approach entirely. Whenever she felt that she had come across a bottleneck in the improvement of her battle axe, she switched to a new weapon, gaining mastery over it before switching back and applying what she had learned. Every time she completed such a cycle, her skill would enter an entirely new tier, touching upon levels those her age shouldn't have any business touching. Lionel himself could touch upon the 4th layered state when he finished his spear dance. Of course, this was for his 6th-dimensional spear force. Aina, likewise, used 6th-dimensional battle axe force, and just that swing along was very clearly in at least the 2nd layered state. Watching the woman he loved display such skill so casually, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but glow. He didn't often think about how others viewed Aina, so long as they didn't dare to say such things before him, and he wasn't aware of their thoughts. He didn't care, quite frankly. All that mattered to him were Aina's feelings and his own. However, he was still human. Seeing Aina shine like this couldn't help but put a smile on his face. I wonder. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. Lionel's lips began to move as Aina swung her axe down. He didn't seem to be saying anything, but if others played exceptionally close attention, it would be possible to see Aina's ears subtly twitching from time to time. Due to the time constraints, Lionel hadn't found a moment to tell Aina about force manipulation. Everything she had accomplished until this moment was done on her own merits. In truth, Lionel hesitated to tell many people about this. That was because he understood that sometimes, overthinking things could come as a detriment instead of help. There were many instincts beasts and children would have that adults would lose. And that because while awareness was a virtue, it was also a hindrance in many ways. Being aware of force manipulation might help some, but it could very well hinder most. However, Lionel had a great deal of faith in Aina. Until now, she had already been forging ahead on her own. So what about now? Lionel spoke quickly, and Aina was more than strong enough in mind to catch it all. Her eyes seemed to become dazed for a moment before they sharpened considerably, her aura flourishing. A delicate roar came from her lips that quickly morphed into something far more majestic. A war cry that echoed across the skies that shook the walls of the city below her. Bang! I think you should take a look at Aina's battle axe landed upon a shield of water that Vega had manifested. The latter had reacted quickly, her expression changing when she sensed the strength that was behind Aina's blow. But rather than taking a step back, she moved forward. Their clash echoed throughout the surroundings, the immediate sections of the wall crumbling and quaking as the other members of the Quarius family found themselves flying out in all directions. Vega's gaze narrowed. Her defenses were probably her greatest strength, but right now her water shield was threatening to collapse beneath the blow of a sixth-dimensional existence? Just what was going on here, exactly? Her blue dress fluttered as she took a step back. Her fingers tapped at the air and the water shield's form shifted, inverting and forming a large net that shot toward Aina. Aina's battle axe suddenly became akin to a venomous snake in her hands, losing its form and curving out while its twin blades twinkled beneath the pulsing streaks of lightning in the dark clouds that accumulated above. The net of water shattered, becoming countless droplets of sparkling blue water. It didn't carry a natural hue at all, instead infused with a large amount of force that increased the humidity to the point that although not a single drop had fallen onto Aina, it still felt like she was enveloped from all sides. A sticky layer of something uncomfortable bore down upon her, and Aina seemed to understand what it was instantly. Vega wasn't just controlling the water droplets that were clearly visible to her naked eye. She was also controlling the invisible water vapor. This stickiness wasn't just humidity, it was a warning sign. Aina's gaze flickered and her stance shifted. With a twist of her wrist, the seemingly flexible battle axe in her small palms became as rigid as an ancient tree piercing the skies. Its polearm crashed into the crumbling wall beneath them, sending out a rumbling echo that spread out in all directions. It sounded like Aina had suddenly hit a resonating bronze bell at that moment. Instantly, the droplets of water shattered and the humidity scattered before it could coat Aina any longer. She took a step forward as Vega's gaze narrowed, swinging her battle axe in a wide arc that bore down with a menacing momentum. Her movement flowed like water, her body moving instinctually to shatter all the traps Vega had set up before they could even become fully formed plots. It really felt like she wasn't thinking at all. Her mind was her body, and her body was her mind. They moved and functioned as one without the slightest delay or lag. Vega's expression became serious. She realized that this was no longer a matter she could just casually brush off. If she wanted to win, she would have to treat Aina like a real opponent. Defeat Aina, gather the momentum to her side, and crush the army that lay in wait. Vega's aura suddenly changed. From a governess, her demeanor became valiant. Her blue hair lifted into the air, becoming like a raging river. Chapter 2051. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 2051. Limit. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2051 limit. Vega stepped forward to meet Aina's strike, but she met some resistance in the air. Her expression changed slightly, but her movements didn't become any slower. In fact, they sped up considerably, her body tensing and her force raging through his nodal pathways like the tides of the ocean. Lionel watched with narrowed eyes. Whenever he experienced Aina's battle style, he couldn't help but be in awe. That sudden slam of her battle axe on the ground just now seemed simple, but it was incomparably complex. That domain-like attack, or it could even be more accurately stated to be a defensive ward of sorts, had hints that reminded Lionel a lot of how he and Aina would resonate their forces as one, using concepts that Lionel had learned from his grandfather's way of the spear. However, Aina had used a reverse concept. She purposely failed in an attempt to resonate with the force in her surroundings, and as a result, repulsed them away. This attempt acted like a dome-like barrier, expelling her enemy's own domain attack. While this seemed simple, it was extremely complex, especially since Lionel was certain that Aina had simply done it on a whim, following her instincts without the slightest thought. Force wasn't a naturally benign substance in most cases. They were designed to fuse into one or pass by each other without a care. Only when controlled by the intention of a person could this natural instinct of theirs be mediated. If things weren't like this, how could ocean waters contain wind force that allowed Lionel to breathe? How could any ecosystem exist at all, for that matter, without collapsing in on itself? With how subtly Vega was using her force just now, if Aina had chosen any other method of attack, it wouldn't have worked to help her, but rather help Vega instead. Lionel couldn't help but grin. Bang. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0M. The two met, one palm and one battle axe. Whipping winds sliced into the crumbling wall and the devastated surroundings. Even the whirlpools below no longer seemed to be a great deal at all, feeling like kids' toys in the face of the destruction of the clash. Quickly, they separated before shooting forward again and separating once more. Every time they met, the walls crumbled to another degree, collapsing piece by piece. It didn't seem to be a gold-grade wall at all, and rather felt like clay putty. Vega's body was like water. Every clash caused a ripple to echo through her, dispersing into splashes of water. It really felt as though every time Aina attacked her, the sound of a boulder crashing into the surface of a calm lake would come to mind. Aina's own style was entirely unpredictable. Sometimes her battle axe would be as soft as silk, other times it would be rigid and powerful, sometimes it bent like a bow and other times it would be as swift as a sword. And yet, each one of these styles smoothly transitioned into one another, sliding back and forth and becoming like one insurmountable mountain. Vega was beginning to feel suffocated. Every time she used a move to catch Aina off guard, the latter would adjust. The next time such a move appeared, she would seem to react even before Vega would, almost as though she could predict what Vega would do before she even knew herself. Aina's skin glowed, her golden irises gaining a red ring that pulsed with a stronger and stronger light until it suddenly solidified. Bang! An explosive phantom appeared behind Aina, causing Lionel's eyes to narrow. She swung her battle axe, its power increasing explosively. I think you should take a look at third layered. Vega took a strong step back, her feet nearly slipping beneath the crumbling stone. She slipped to the side, regaining her bearings and redirecting Aina's power. However, her gaze couldn't help but congeal. What was this, a lineage factor? Was this the lineage factor of the Brazinger family? Suddenly, Aina swung again. Fourth layered. Bang. Vega was sent flying, her lips parting as a jet of blood came from her lips. She soared like a streaking bullet, crashing down below and leveling several buildings as her bones crackled and popped. Aina still felt as though a power was surging within her, its strength reaching towering heights. After Lionel had spoken, she understood the purpose of this manifestation. Much like Emperor's Edict or other such techniques, this manifestation was a technique meant to be paired with the Brazinger family's lineage factor. As for its function, Aina hadn't been certain before, as it was an extension of her body rather than truly being a part of it, but now she understood. It worked akin to a cross between an innate node and a universal cycle. It took her weapon force comprehension and forcefully raised her control over it. In an instant, Aina had gone from being able to wield her battle axe force at a second layered state level to the fourth layered state level, and quite frankly, she didn't feel like this was her limit. Her force bubbled and her strength soared, and then soared again. Lionel couldn't help but cough lightly, wondering if she had told this little T-Rex in beautiful skin about this. How was he going to keep her in line in the future? He was already whipped. He stood no chance now. Aina raised her battle axe, the manifestation to her back solidifying to the point it became entirely corporeal. It looked as though she had brought a second version of herself into existence, beautiful, untouchable, valiant. And then this unmoving manifestation suddenly shuddered and moved. It grabbed at the air, forming its own battle axe. This battle axe resonated with the one in Aina's hand, and complex force arts began to appear one after another. Lionel's pupils constricted. "Aina!" He suddenly roared out, and Aina's heart skipped a beat. Without a word, she retrieved her battle axe and lightly took a step back. In a flash, she appeared by Lionel's side, her visage only slightly flushed as though she hadn't just had a battle that shattered half the landscape of a gold-grade city. Chapter 2052. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 2052. Kill. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2052 Kill. Lionel might be in a different state now, but he was still mindful of the future. Nothing bad was about to happen to Aina just now, but he didn't feel it was necessary to show all of these matters just yet. Using it on this one territory when victory was already in hand was unnecessary. Since Vega was First Nova's woman, he had no intention of killing her. However, she wasn't an heir, so she didn't have a badge to crush and send her out. It would be up to First Nova to do that. Even so, Lionel didn't have any intention of using her as a hostage either. So as things stood now, the only thing he wanted was control over the city's core. For that sort of purpose, this much was already enough. The Aquarius family members, upon realizing Vega had lost the battle, and so miserably at that, couldn't stand idly by any longer. There weren't many of them, and truthfully most of them were actually just Adderworth's subordinates, faithful followers he had gathered over the years. As First Nova, there was no doubt that he had had the most time of them all to succeed in this matter, and his subordinates were most definitely not incompetent. They had understood what Vega wanted to do. Defeating an enemy in a one-on-one battle before the start of a large-scale war was an excellent way to claim the morale for your side. However, things hadn't gone as planned. Even so, they were all veterans of the battlefield, and each one of them understood that they still ultimately had the upper hand. They were the defending party, and their numbers were far greater. In addition, if Lionel and the others were too slow, they would end up pincered from multiple sides. Not only had they already contacted Adderworth, but their members who were focused on scouting out the region and clearing dungeons and the like could come back any time. However, maybe none of them actually expected what happened next. Lionel raised a hand and the Sky's family moved forward, their valiant armors glistening even under the rolling clouds above. At first, not many had thought much of the storm clouds above. They had a storm-related city and this was quite normal. There was nothing much to think about. But none of them realized just how odd it was until just now. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0MIT felt as though every time the Sky's family raised their feet and connected with the waters beneath them, the skies would rumble again. The cadence of an army's march matched with the thunderous rage of nature, filling their enemies with an unexpected trepidation, one they had no idea how to account for. Suddenly, crackle! An arc of lightning descended from the skies and crashed into the city below. At first, it was just one, but then there was a second, and then a third, then a fourth. It looked as though it was harming nothing at all until the first person was struck. A cry of agony echoed before they fell into a pile of crumpled flesh. Fire! Fire now! Vega barely pulled herself out from the rubble. She could only be described to be in a sorry state. Her dress was torn in countless places, one of her arms hung limply by her side, entirely unable to move, while blood flowed from her lips like a waterfall, coating her chin and dripping down into the cleavage of what remained of her clothing. She didn't have time to fathom how she, a genius of the Void Palace and leader of a legacy faction, could possibly lose to an Aina who had lost a 20-year advantage. All she could think about was trying to preserve Adderworth's hard work to the best of her abilities. She had betrayed even her own family for the sake of being here. There was no way that she could allow things to end so easily. I think you should take a look at. Unfortunately, Because of the battle she had just had with Aina, many of the ballista units that were directly facing the Skies family had fallen into the city, over the edge of the walls and into the water, or had just been directly destroyed. As a result, many that were facing off to the side had to overextend themselves, awkwardly changing their aim direction, and shooting from a much longer distance. Suddenly, phantoms began to appear in the army one after another. Giants constructed of lightning rose from the water, formed of the force from the warriors that worked together beneath its protection. These giants of lightning struck out with their palms, smashing the projectiles into ashes while ignoring the ones that never stood a chance. Lionel waved another hand, and the oryx stepped forward, the ocean rumbling beneath them. In fact, they shook the ocean waves so much that even the whirlpools were beginning to show signs of collapsing, unable to maintain their proper state. Suddenly, the third eyes of the oryx all split open one after another. The shadows of several crimson eyes began to appear in the skies. Staring at the sight, Vega felt a shudder. There was something oddly sinister about them, as though they were peering into the depths of her soul, and yet there was absolutely nothing that she could do about it. During their hyper-evolution, the oryx hadn't seemed to undergo many changes, but this was because most of their evolution had been concentrated into their eyes. The third eye of the oryx was oddly robust, carrying none of the usual fragility of what one would expect from an eye. And what had always been interesting to Lionel was the fact that their evolution had been concentrated into their eyes. The third eye of the oryx was oddly robust, carrying none of the usual fragility of what one would expect from an eye. And what had always been interesting to Lionel was the fact that their third eye was located right on the forehead, taking up space in the location their ethereal glabella should have been. So, when he created the set of armor they would use in the month he had before the air wars began, he took advantage of that. Lionel's lip curled as the illusory eyes in the sky pulsed, glowing a fiendish bright red. Kill. Audio notes. I'll be updating this novel this month. Enjoy the mass release. Chapter 2053. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 2053. Absolute. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The flashing eyes pulsed one final time before solidifying. The moment they did, an eruption of violent force surged out like a raging tide. At first they weren't very controlled, splashing out like a spray of water from a hose, but very quickly, the oryx seemed to get a grip on their bearings, reining in the trembling blast of force and concentrating it into countless red lasers that covered the skies. The force was devastating. It crushed everything in its path, disintegrating it. Many died without even time to scream out for help, and the so-called walls of Goldgrade were crushed like paper, collapsing without any sort of resistance. Seeing this scene, Lionel couldn't help but think about the first time he had come across an oryx. Back then, the oryx in question had had an ability index almost exactly like this, but that man had just been one of many. And since it was an ability index, it couldn't just be casually passed down from oryx to oryx. Ability indexes weren't hereditary from Lionel's understanding of things. However, what was so crucial about this memory was what it told Lionel about the oryx race. The eye was an incredibly fragile thing. As crazy as it was for Lionel to have formed a node in his brainstem so long ago, forming one in your eyes was seen as equally crazy if not even more so. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M nodes had to be connected to one another, so running a nodal pathway from your eye to other parts of your body only gave you, really, two choices. The first was to go through your face, and the second was to go through your brain. The first might not seem so bad, until you realized that there were only two choices for succeeding in this path as well. The first was to disrupt the normal flow of your bone structure, or most accurately, your skull. And the second was to use the thin skin on your face. Both weren't very good options. Running a nodal pathway through your bones would ruin its structural integrity and create a weak point in your body. And as for running a nodal pathway through the skin and muscle of your face would limit how thick you could make it, unless you were alright with a large, vein-like snake running across your face, or you were alright with limiting your future potential. The second option of running it through your brain, but this was even more dangerous than forming a node in your brain stem. There were even more moving parts, And increasing the size of your nodal pathway in the future would come with a new set of challenges every time. To top all of this off, there wasn't usually much of a necessity or benefit to forming nodes in your eyes to begin with. Those who had eye-related lineage factors could use their strength naturally without doing this. That was because the existence of one's ethereal glabella alone already created all the networks you would need in your mind. And those that didn't have such abilities would just be wasting their time for what was effectively just vision that was a little bit sharper than normal. This, however, was where the anatomy of the oryx became so absolutely shocking. Their third eye wasn't just in place of their ethereal glabella. Lionel was actually quite certain that it was their ethereal glabella. I think you should take a look at the implications of this matter were shocking, because it went beyond just hoping for an ability index related to eyes was birthed within them. Instead, it was possible to take advantage of this such that they could create their own abilities off the back of it. This wasn't just a quirk of their anatomy, it was effectively a lineage factor. What else was a lineage factor if not a biological quirk that could be passed down through the generations? The problem was that the oryx faced a similar problem to Lionel after he had evolved beyond the level of the snowy star owl. And that was that they were too far in their infancy to have the techniques they needed to make use of their abilities. So, Lionel created it for them. Rather than wasting time creating techniques, refining them, and improving them, Lionel took the crudest ability such an eye would have and amplified it to the greatest degree. What was the ethereal glabella if not a hub for the affinities of its owner? It was through the ethereal glabella that one gained access to their ability index. It could be said that it was the hub that made a person, and it also happened to be the location within which one could gain access to their soul. The spiritual were born only as ethereal glabellas, and it was around said ethereal glabella that they constructed their own bodies. As a result of this, it could be said that almost from birth, they had already entered the fourth dimension. And not only that, they were intimately familiar with both their affinities and how their bodies worked alongside it. This was part of why the spirituals were so absolutely powerful. And Lionel even believed that given enough time, it might actually be possible for the oryx to replicate something similar given the access they had to their ethereal glabellas. It could be said that, better than any force art, better than any treasure, what the ethereal glabella was best at was accumulating force and expelling it. When one gained such unprecedented access to one's ethereal glabella, right from the purest possible source, the effect could only be said to be absolute. Feeling the power coursing through them, for the first time, the oryx became keenly aware of just the kind of strength and power they had. There were many sayings about the eyes being the window to the soul, none of them being literal. But in the case of the oryx, it just might very well be. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 2054. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 2054. Shame if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel landed from the skies above. In the surroundings, the battle continued to rage on, but it was very clear who had won and who had lost. Maybe if Vega had holed up and chosen to fight with her army instead of going head-to-head with Aina, things may have ended differently, or at the very least, it would have been much more difficult. But in the end, she had made a true mistake in underestimating her. The result of their battle was something that completely shocked the whole of the human domain. To have not just the skill of a life-grade force pill crafter, but to also have such strength at the mere 6th dimension. This was enough of a fear for Aina to skyrocket to the very pinnacle of the Queen Beauty leaderboards. Not just a small number of individuals had thought Aina to be someone Lionel had picked because of her beauty. In truth, it was even difficult to associate her with the Brazinger family purely because her eyes were not red and her hair was not crimson. This sort of thing had also caused many rumors to spread about the real backstory behind her existence. While the Brazinger family had gained a secret, almost cult-like following, appearing from nowhere and displaying such great strength, because Aina didn't share their patented look, it made it very easy to dismiss her. Until this moment, it was like this that many began to replay the events of the start of the Air Wars in their minds. recalling the valiance and elegance that both Lionel and Aina had walked in with. The connotation of that moment flipped again and again in their thoughts. Every time Lionel accomplished a shocking feat, or Aina flipped their understanding of the world on its head, it felt like that memory was further ingrained into the psyches. It was recast and remodeled, etched deeper and deeper until it became a memory that they couldn't forget. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M. But what was especially shocking about this was that Lionel and Aina weren't only gaining the label of shocking geniuses, but also that of underdogs. What once was the perception that the two were overly arrogant and knew too little about the wider geniuses of the human domain, became a shocking story of a couple fighting with one another against all odds. This story only became more and more of the public's truth as Lionel's trump cards turned the tide again, and again and again. And now, with one of the main pillars of First Nova's power crippled, the reality that Lionel just might win this was settling in. Vega looked as though she had lost her soul. Sitting on her knees, looking around with a blank expression, she almost couldn't believe what had happened. She hardly had the strength to sit up, and yet as though she was torturing herself, she looked through every broken brick and fallen building. She had so much experience commanding a large number of people, so much experience in battle, so much knowledge to give and strength to use, and yet it felt like she had been slowly suffocated to death, like a frog in slowly boiling water. She vaguely understood that this feeling came from Aina's combat, and then Lionel's subsequent command over the situation, but understanding this didn't make her feel any better. If anything, she felt wholly inferior. Aina's combat strength was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Facing her had felt like she was facing off against herself. She knew everything that was going to happen ahead of time. Before she could even breathe properly, Aina had breathed for her. And yet Vega was absolutely certain that Aina didn't have a sensory-type ability. I think you should take a look at then there was Lionel. After the stingrays had been forced to spread out due to the numerous whirlpools, she had believed that the battle would be easy. Picking apart smaller groups of enemies was far easier, and her marksmen could truly make their skill known. But how could she have expected that the storm characteristics of her territory would become more beneficial to Lionel than it was to her? The strikes of lightning had been completely devastating. And then to make matters worse, his command over the Oryx and the deployment of their AI abilities was truly seamless. While her own ballistic units were struggling to fire from a longer range, Lionel crippled their visibility with sparks of lightning, and then directed the crimson laser beams like they were his own spear strikes. He didn't seem to be trying very hard, but he always managed to find the most crucial location in the battlefield, crushing an upswell before it could even begin to form. At the same time, the spread-out stingrays became a nightmare for the troops that were attempting to return at their fastest possible speed. Somehow, the greatest advantage of their city had also become the greatest detriment. Just like the stingrays, the large groups of returning reinforcements were forced to separate, so as to avoid the whirlpools themselves. Unlike Lionel's territories, Vega hadn't invested in outposts, or more accurately, hadn't invested in teleporting outposts. She had thought that it was an unnecessary waste of points, only to find out in the end that such a thing could have saved her in the end. Lionel had simply moved too fast. In the end, it was precisely because his numbers were so few that he was able to approach Vega's territory with such speed, beginning their attack before even the first wave had succeeded in returning. And now her city lay in shambles. She had let Adderworth down and the guilt was eating her up on the inside. Boom. In the skies above, the clouds split and a figure suddenly appeared high in the skies. With him there were 3 other individuals, but it was very clear that there were no others. Vega looked up with a blank expression, only barely showing some light when she recognized First Nova. But after that, she looked away, unwilling to meet his eye. The shame felt now was only greater. Chapter 2055. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:21 p.m. Chapter 2055. Golden armor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Adderworth fell down from the skies with great speed before he suddenly came to a stop about 10 meters above the ground. He quickly scanned the region, his expression solemn. It was only when he laid eyes on Vega that he sighed a slight breath of relief. He had no way of knowing who it was that had been attacking, mostly because even Vega hadn't known until the sudden moment that Lionel appeared. So he had come expecting the very worst. At first, Vega had just informed him of the problem, and he felt that she might be able to handle it on her own. He had a great amount of faith in her since he was allowing her to do such an important task. But after he received a second message, he rushed over with his greatest speed, even using a high-level reward to appear as quickly as possible. It was only now he knew that it was actually Seventh Nova that had caused all of this, but this made him feel better since he trusted that Lionel wouldn't harm Vega's life. This littlest cousin of his seemed to be quite unruly, but Adderworth knew well that Lionel's heart had always been in the right place. Even so, after he saw Vega's state of injury, Adderworth's heart couldn't help but tremble. He rushed over, landing by Vega and checking to see if she was truly all right. He didn't even look toward Lionel, his mind entirely occupied with other thoughts. Vega pushed Adderworth's hands away, unwilling to be in his care as she struggled to stand up on her own. But not long afterward, she fell toward him and Adderworth had no choice but to catch her, the gloominess in his eyes only growing. Adderworth passed Vega to one of the members of the Quarius family, his heart crumbling as he heard Vega mumble that she was sorry again and again. This chapter upload first at Innovel USB. C0 Mall. The while, Lionel didn't say or do anything. He didn't feel that it was necessary to do so. The situation was quite clear. Adderworth's army was clearly lagging behind, so if he was here with 4, his goal was to stall for as much time as possible. In truth, he had a decent chance. The Stingrays were ocean-bound and the city was floating above water. It wasn't exactly easy for them to affect the current battlefield, though they would obviously have something to say if and when Adderworth's men arrived. At the same time, Adderworth himself was clearly a powerhouse. If Fifth Nova had been so powerful, just more powerful was First Nova, who had not only years on him but was quite well known for his combat prowess to begin with. There was a reason Adderworth had been able to uphold the stalwart Polarm party turned faction despite only being at the 6th dimension back then. And now, he was well into the 7th dimension, and might very well be the one with the highest tier of all the participants of these air wars. Adderworth slowly stood before Lionel, the two of them standing about 3 to 4 meters apart. Then he slowly sighed. In truth, he had been among the number that believed that Lionel would be eliminated by now. Although he had the spear domain ring, not everyone used spears, and at the same time, he wasn't quite familiar with the abilities of the segmented cube. As far as he understood, it was just an auxiliary item, and he was fairly correct about that. Due to this, he had never really cared much if Lionel kept the 2 heirlooms, not to mention the fact as a 6th-dimensional existence. He felt that Lionel deserved at least a small handicap, as far as that went. I think you should take a look at but now. Adderworth took a breath. He felt that it was inappropriate to speak at the moment, so though he had something he wanted to say, he held back. His body trembled and a bronze crown suddenly appeared across his forehead. His aura surged as his bronze halo descended down the length of his body. When it bounced back up, a radiant golden armor took shape, one so blinding that Lionel couldn't help but think of his uncle. Uncle Montez wore a similar armor, but the difference was that he wore his all the time. That said, the fact that Adderworth dared to make his armor out of this material spoke volumes. The core of this armor was known as the Moralis Oregon. This was an ore capable of swallowing other ores in exchange for one thing: weight. The more it swallowed, the heavier it became. The heavier it became, the more difficult it was to wield. When it reached a certain point, the armor would form its own continuous gravitational field, pulling and pushing on your body continuously. This armor had once been used purely as a tool for training, until one madman decided to make it his main divine armor. And that madman was Lionel's grandfather. Velasco was far too arrogant to follow the path of another, and Lionel hadn't even learned that this was an option until he had read through the research papers of the Void Library. It was obvious that Velasco hadn't wanted his son to follow others either. Montez was different though, clearly not minding one bit about following the path of his own father. And surprisingly, it seemed that Adderworth had taken the same path as the two of them. Almost instantly, a radiant aura spread out in all directions, weighing down upon Lionel, and making him feel as though thick walls were pressing down on his skin from all sides. It was a truly suffocating aura. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he took out his black rod spear, pointing it forward and down toward the ground. His momentum was very calm and unassuming compared to Adderworth as his bronze aura took shape, forming his second-tier divine armor. Even so, he didn't back off in the slightest, his expression the picture of calm as it was swallowed up by his mask. The two knew how important this battle was. No words needed to be exchanged. Bang! Bang! The locations they had just stood upon were suddenly replaced by two craters instead, the two of them having vanished. Chapter 2056. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:20 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 2056. Spheres of Destruction. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It felt as though an atomic bomb had exploded in the skies. The cacophony burnt eardrums, and the wall pressure of wind nearly levels the city, almost knocking the gold-grade territory out of the air. The city's cloud structure, the fluffy grayness that held it up in the skies, sank considerably, bouncing against the enormous whirlpool that formed its foundation, and sending a surge of war into the skies. The resonating booms were felt bone deep, the catastrophic aftermath making the surrounding ocean for over a kilometer sink by tens of meters before a rush of water surged to replace it. This resulted in rocketing waves, devastating currents, violent twirls and towering tsunamis. Just this singular clash, happening for only the briefest of moments, made those in the immediate surroundings feel as though the entire world was being upturned. And yet, it was just the first clash. Even after it was levied, the two novas didn't appear in their sights again. The only sign that they were still clashing was the second resounding boom, then the third, then the fourth. Violent and nigh invisible spheres of destruction began to appear across the skies. Every time they occurred, the devastation would appear first before the sound wave followed quickly after. The buildings that remained intact didn't do so for long. Their windows shattered into countless pieces, their foundations cracked and shattered. They began to lean to one side of another, almost falling until the true wave of devastation hit them, burning them to ash or crushing them into flat land. Adderworth's body drew streaks of gold in the sky, while Lionel's drew lines of violet. Their movements were incomparably fast, their afterimages hardly taking shape before they moved again. After a moment, it felt as though there were dozens of the pair in the sky, each clashing with one another, and then retreating to clash once more. This chapter upload first at NVUSB. C0M First Nova's fists carried the weight of a world behind them, while Lionel's spear was deathly. For the former, every clash felt as though his body was being shaken by Mother Nature herself. The ruckus of a Category 5 hurricane, or an earthquake rated at a 10 on the Richter scale forming their own microcosm within his body. For Lionel, his expression was unreadable, entirely unfazed. The 10 stars to his back fueled his body with an unmatched glory and light. There was no doubt that without his main weapon by his side, First Nova's strength had tanked considerably, but the light in his eyes was no less fierce. His golden armor shone with a radiant glow, the lines of ambrosia he was drawing across the skies, as though the casual swipes of a god's finger, grew thicker and more robust. As they did so, the pressure he placed on Lionel only became greater as his strikes became heavier and heavier. Adderworth's fist met the polearm of Lionel's spear, his knee driving upward in an attempt to catch Lionel's chin. However, Lionel reacted even faster, his own knee driving upward. A familiar resonating boom filled the skies as a sphere of air pressure echoed in all directions. The ground below looked as though a crater had formed while the dense clouds above dispersed into a wide circle once again. The two separated quickly and clashed once more. However, before his fist could land this time, Adderworth's pupils constricted and he suddenly spun around, punching out with all his might. He didn't seem to notice Lionel's fist coming toward his back at all as he continued to punch out at empty air. Lionel's own gaze sharpened as he suddenly formed a clone of emulation spatial force. The two swapped places instantly, and the region that Adderworth was punching toward was replaced by a clone of Lionel, who stepped out from seemingly nowhere. "I think you should take a look at?" Adderworth felt that his back was now vulnerable once again, but rather than turning around once more, his gaze flashed, the skies flashing as a bolt of lightning as thick as a giant's waist descended toward the real Lionel toward his back. Lionel's pupils constricted. Ability indexes couldn't be inherited, but Adderworth actually had one so similar to his father's. With a roar, Lionel's aura flourished as his lotus domain took shape. In the past, his lotus domain was mostly invisible to the naked eye, but this time a spinning illusory lotus flower appeared above his head, swallowing the bolt of lightning whole as Adderworth's fist blasted his clone to smithereens. The lightning force was absorbed by Lionel's lotus as his fist continued forward as though nothing had happened. First Nova was caught off guard, but it was already too late to change things. The lightning force became a wild vibrational force, coursing through Lionel's body like rumbling thunder. Papa papa pa. As though countless firecrackers were going off, Lionel's fist landed on Adderworth's back, the echo of his fist causing 10 destructive spheres of air pressure to form all at once, destroying the ground below and the skies above 10 times over. Adderworth spit out a mouthful of blood, his body shooting out like a cannon through the skies. This streak of gold was less elegant in comparison to the others, but it was no less speedy. Boom. He crashed into the ground below, being buried so deep that he ran through the length of the city, crashing through its foundation, through the cloud that kept it in the sky, and into the ocean waters below. Lionel's figure flickered and his 2 Void Star Force stars radiant a powerful dark bluish-black glow. Looking upon it made one feel as though they were staring into a black sun, the gorgeous bits of discoloration feeling like the painting of a demon overlord. The raging waters, unable to calm down from their battle, surged around Lionel, responding to his beck and call as Adderworth shot out from the waters, rushing toward Lionel like a speed bullet. Lionel's roar echoed once again as the snaking dark waters that responded to his call formed countless flood dragons. Chapter 2057. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:20 and 47 seconds p.m. Chapter 2057. Surge if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's roar seemed to become the roar of the dark flood dragons. Their scales solidified and their foreheads began to protrude with horns as though they might become true dragons at any moment. At that moment, standing amidst the falling water droplets and the snaking flood dragons, Lionel looked as though he was a god of the sea, his gaze shining a brighter and brighter violet as his aura continued to rise like a tsunami's tide. He brandished his spear toward the oncoming Adderworths, and he suddenly took a step forward. The flood dragons responded to his call. Like an ancient dance of a discipline long lost, Lionel's spear thrust forward. The movement was simple, and yet elegant, silent, and yet deadly. He hardly moved at all, and it all looked effortless, but it felt like the world had resonated with his very being, heeding the call of his spear force and wrapping around it. He was small in comparison to the ocean, barely considered a single drop in a body that extended for thousands of kilometers. But the moment he moved, the waters around him raged and those outside his scope suddenly became deathly quiet. The first thrust caused the flood dragons to surge forward, ramming into Adderworth and sending him flying backward with another mouthful of blood. The second thrust caused them to spiral around one another, their bodies dancing and swimming through the skies, powerful but intentional, enraged and yet controlled. The third thrust fused them into a single existence. Their horn finally manifested, piercing the skies above. Their body snaked around the city 3 times, and yet still had length for more. But more importantly than all of that, their gaze suddenly gained life. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0MIT truly felt like a dragon had come into being, carrying all the magnificence of the legends. The savageness of a beast, the greed of a demon, the majesty of an emperor, a truly untouchable existence whether now or into forever. Lionel had always had a fascination with dragons, ever since he had learned that his mother's emperor's might construct had been that of a dragon. The first time he had used the concept of a flood dragon was in his fight for the violet token on planet Luxnix against Miguel. But it had been entirely impossible for him to touch upon the true majesty of a dragon, at least not the kind his mother had succeeded in, so he had only ever been able to form flood dragons. Until now. His third thrust landed. The ocean split, an abyssal hole spanning hundreds of meters to the left and right, along with countless dozens of kilometers downward, formed. The power behind it was so devastating that the walls didn't collapse around it immediately. In fact, for the longest time, it seemed as though it would be entirely impossible to succeed in such a thing. Lionel had perfectly fused the Luxnix family force arts, his spear arts, and his universal force into one, and it hadn't even felt difficult. His comprehension over water force, his force manipulation, made him feel like a god that could accomplish anything. He stood in the skies with an arrogant sort of silence. Behind him, his 10 stars sat, each one a different color, but each one just as powerful in momentum. A truly powerful scene. It was said that a picture was worth 1,000 words, but so was a single decisive memory. Maybe this current Lionel was one those who were currently watching would never forget, a Lionel who had grabbed onto their hearts and refused to let go. But also a Lionel they didn't want to let go of in the first place. I think you should take a look at, however. To this Lionel's surprise, Adderworth still rushed out from the abyss he had been left it, soaring out from the vortex of force and past the roaring dragon before appearing before Lionel in the skies with a haggard appearance. His armor was cracked in several places, his blood was leaking out and mixing with once radiant gold, and his breathing was heavy enough to hear even against the commotion of the clashing waves and thunderous booms. He breathed deeply, his gaze locked onto Lionel before him. His eyes were surprisingly calm. He didn't have the despair of someone who felt their dreams of a lifetime slipping away, nor was there any sort of overt confidence either. It was simply the gaze of a man who knew how to take one step at a time, who didn't care how long the road was or how difficult it would be to travel. All he had in mind was how to raise his foot and firmly place it down one more time. Adderworth finally seemed to catch his breath after a few seconds, the rumbling in the skies matching with the arcs of lightning that colored his gaze. Having calmed himself, he reached out a palm, a streak of lightning descending from the skies above and hitting him squarely. That said, he didn't make any attempt to dodge or avoid the situation, standing perfectly still. When the scene cleared enough for others to see, it was clear that Adderworth was still standing tall. But now there was a blade in his hand. It was a truly crude blade. The edge was sharp as it continued to crackle about under the influence of the lightning it had been formed by, while it was also much too large. At the same time, it didn't have a hilt and seemed to be entirely blade. It wasn't exactly a sword, and it didn't seem like a saber either. It felt a lot more like a piece of scrap metal even though it wasn't nearly as defined in shape. Then there was, of course, the worst part. Adderworth only knew how to use the spear. He wasn't like Second Nova who had great skill in sabers. In addition, even if he formed a different weapon than the spear, if he used it with the intention and skill of a spearman, it would shatter before Lionel just the same. But having succeeded in forming this blade, Adderworth's gaze only became even more calm, frightening so. Then, the golden aura around him began to solidify, flowing into the enormous blade in his palm. Under the gazes of those watching, Adderworth's piece of scrap metal began to shrink under an untold pressure. Chapter 2058. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:20 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 2058. The insurmountable gap. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It all happened exceptionally quickly. With how far apart they were, even if Lionel had wanted to stop it, he couldn't. Using his spatial force to close the distance might have been possible, but the sudden volatile use of force made it incredibly dangerous to do so. Then by the time Adderworth started, if he stepped in to stop the process midway, the both of them would end up dying. Lionel realized what Adderworth was doing immediately. He was using the powerful gravitational force of his armor, concentrating it into a single area, and then using that force to concentrate his lightning into a mighty, unstoppable blade. That was akin to infusing all the strength of his divine armor into his weapon, and though he would lose his domain as a result, the trade-off was more than worth it. The divine armor was faulty to begin with. It was a training equipment that turned most of its pressure onto its user. Although the pressure turned onto the user would increase their individual strength by making their hits and body both harder and much heavier, there were great trade-offs to that as well, such as lower speed, less maneuverability, not to mention a much weaker stamina overall. Against most opponents, this was enough. But against Lionel, who had an exceptionally powerful body capable of withstanding his heavy hits, not to mention the fact that Lionel's speed was also able to overwhelm his own as a result of his light force and spatial force, Adderworth, who was very much used to crushing those of his generation, found himself at a great disadvantage. The only choice now was to greatly increase his attack power. Usually this could be done with his spear. This wasn't the first time he had used this technique. Although he had never needed to use it against an enemy before, he had practiced it more times than he could count. The trouble was that he had always concentrated his gravitational force onto his spear. But just now, in desperate straits, he wondered if he could use it on other things. Now for the first time he brought out this ability. Whether he lost or won, there was no doubt that in the next few weeks, his strength would grow explosively in a short time. But he didn't care about any of that. All he wanted was this victory. The blood of the Morales rushed through his veins, his gaze reddening as his heartbeat began to accelerate once more. But this time it wasn't due to fatigue, and it was instead due to excitement. This sort of battle, it would be his. A wild grin spread across Adderworth's face, and his usually demure and restrained personality became wild and unrestrained. He howled into the skies, raging streaks of lightning descending like pythons from the skies. They connected the clouds and ocean waters below, making the formations that had been formed by the Skies family look like nothing more than a joke now. Adderworth's figure flickered and vanished as Lionel's gaze narrowed. Suddenly, all the snaking streaks of lightning that were descending from the skies all pointed toward Lionel, rushing toward him. Lionel only just barely registered this as he perceived Adderworth's blade had appeared right before his face. Lionel suddenly grinned as he met Adderworth's maddened gaze. Indeed, this was a taste of his own medicine. The difference was he had used the untamed seas while Adderworth had used the unruly skies. Since it was all so similar, though Lionel really wanted to see who was better. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M with a roar, the two clashed once again. But this time it felt as though the apocalypse had descended. Members of the Quarius family and Lionel's subordinates were forced to retreat into the distance. All they could see were snaking dragons. On one side, there were the roaring masses of lightning behemoths, while on the other, there was the unbreakable legion of infuriated water emperors. Lightning and water clashed. From afar, it seemed as though the skies and the ocean had suddenly become infuriated with one another, each throwing everything they had. A brotherly spat of fury, a clash of Zeus and Poseidon. This time, every time Lionel clashed with Adderworth, it felt like his own world was collapsing. He had no skill with the blade, and purposely used no skills so as not to let his expertise with the spear leak out. He swung with wild abandon, his howls and unbridled laughter filling the skies as he attacked again and again. He came from all angles, and because the blade was so heavy, it took Lionel too long to recover to counter before the next, resulting in a scene where he could only match Adderworth's pace. Even so, Lionel's gaze continued to glow a fiercer and fiercer light. Violet fog of star fusion. King's might continued to rush out from the joints of his armor, his spear blocked and parried, looking for an opening. Everything about his demeanor aside from his devilish grin seemed perfectly and entirely calm. And then his gaze suddenly flashed. A blazing heat suddenly appeared, and the entire situation flipped. The roaring dragons suddenly gained a flickering red-gold flame in their eyes. Their bodies bubbled and the gaps of their scales began to glow with a savage blood-red light. Before the lightning snakes could react, they were entirely shattered. I think you should take a look at Lionel took a step back, sweeping his leg out of the way of Adderworth's next wild blow, his expression the picture of absolute calm. As his feet glided backward, an elegant arc was drawn as the dragon solidified into the foundation of an entirely new creature, radiating with a violet-black glow that caused the world to fall into silence. Lionel's figure seemed to vanish even though he hadn't moved an inch. It was like the only thing the entire world could focus on was his spear, fluttering through the skies as though it had a mind of its own. The violet-black dragon followed the cadence of his movements, its snout and horns becoming the tip of its own spear. As Lionel moved, a force art began to grow beneath his feet, And as the dragon moved, its snaking body formed its own. Adderworth found that he couldn't even touch the hem of Lionel's clothing when this dance begun, and by the time it ended, his pupils could only tremble. Beneath Lionel's feet was his own formed force art. Above his head was the formed force art of the violet-black dragon. When he completed the final thrust, the world came to a pause. Adderworth stood in silence, unable to move. It was like he had been bound by the spear dance, entranced into a dream world he couldn't pull himself out of. It was both illusory and real, both right before his eyes and yet entirely untouchable. The skies above ceased to rumble, and the oceans below became as calm as a lake in the middle of a new moon's night. Adderworth looked down, and he didn't find even a single wound on his body. And yet the ocean below painted an entirely different picture. It was split into two halves entirely, both so clear and calm that it looked like two mirrors facing one another. The split started right behind Adderworth's body, went through the city, and continued indefinitely into the distance. Even with their eyesights, the end of it was impossible to spot. Adderworth shook his head lightly. Crack. His badge, hidden within his armor, shattered and his body began to fade away. All that power, and yet somehow, not a single hair on his head was harmed. Lionel didn't display that strike because he had to. He displayed it so that the world would be aware of the gap between the two of them. The insurmountable gap. Chapter 2059. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:20 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 2059. Determination. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in the air, the tip of his spear as straight and unmoving as a mountain. It pointed downward, and he seemed to be completely open to strikes from all sides. And yet, those who looked upon him felt a shiver in their souls. This simply wasn't a man who could be attacked easily, regardless of what his current state seemed to be. Many felt that even if Lionel seemed to be on his last breath, he simply wasn't someone that could be provoked. When Adderworth appeared on the Morales flagship, he unleashed a sigh. He didn't know what to say for a long time, and it was only after he felt an arm wrap around his shoulders that he seemed to snap out of it, turning to see Second Nova standing by his side, and to his surprise, Fifth Nova standing on the other. Fifth Nova never did things like this, but seeing that all three of them were standing here, looking forward toward Lionel, he seemed to feel that they all experienced the same thing. He's an arrogant bastard, huh? Second Nova mumbled. First Nova looked toward Second Nova with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He could sense a hint of bitterness that wasn't normal of this brother of his. He and Second Nova knew each other quite well. Or it was more accurate to say that they had once been exceptionally close. Sometime within the last 3 decades, a few years even before Lionel had entered the Void Palace, they had begun to grow apart. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0 Of course, First Nova could tell that there was some secret that Second Nova was hiding from him, but if the latter didn't want to tell him, it was hard to force him to. For the longest time, First Nova had assumed that this was just Second Nova's way of telling him that he planned to go all out with him during the Air Wars. But seeing Second Nova now, Adderworth doubted his previous assumption. In fact, he felt that these last few years for Orin had been more complicated than he knew. However, regardless of all of this, he was far more shocked by Orin's words themselves. He didn't really feel like Lionel was all that arrogant. Is he? Adderworth asked lightly. Second Nova laughed as though Adderworth had just told the greatest joke he had ever heard. Even Kira, who had spent the most time with Second Nova recently, was stunned. She hadn't seen him laugh like this in a very, very long time. Maybe not since they were children. Maybe in the beginning he wasn't, but don't you get the feeling from him that he's like someone who started off very serious, and then got too bored to keep up the FAA section audit? Just look at him. He's standing all cool and composed right now, but 5, 3, 2, 1. As though on some sort of cue, Lionel put away his spear and swooped down from the skies, a grin on his face as he swept up Aina. She could only roll her eyes. This guy had really stopped taking things seriously again. Second Nova began to laugh once more. I bet you that he's smiled more today than he has any other day since the Air Wars began. It's really when you think about it. Uncle Velasco and littlest Nova are like two sides of the same coin. Both are supremely arrogant. It's just that one is secluded while the other has a great number of friends. One of them is always focused on their work and can't take a break, while the other is impossibly lazy because everything is beneath his notice. Just looking at them, I can't help but laugh. Both of them look down on the world in their own way and don't put any of us in their eyes. I think you should take a look at the more Oren spoke, the uglier Adworth's expression became. Look at you. Oren laughed even harder. You are always like this, you really don't like to lose, huh? I'm fine with losing dash. Oren's laughter cut him off. You don't need to lie to me, I know you. Adworth's expression became awkward, but watching him laugh like this, he slowly began to smile. It really had been a long time since he had seen Oren laugh. It was as though a burden on his chest had been taken over by someone else. It felt as though he could put his whole faith in someone else now. In truth, Oren had long since surpassed Adworth in strength, but he had still suffered so greatly. There was no reason he should have been so confident in Lionel, and yet he was. The way he saw it, he had already done his very best. Oren had always been a carefree person. It was these burdens that had turned him into a completely different being. However, he was also the type of person to put his all into something and live with the result. Regardless of what happened from here on out, he knew that he had given his everything, so he would live with it. Plus, there was always the hope that Lionel would actually be able to win. Although he felt that it was slim even with the strength he had shown, Oren hoped that Lionel was still holding back something that could turn the tides when the time came. At that moment, Adworth's subordinates began to come out one after another. Suddenly remembering something, Adworth's expression sharpened as he surged forward, landing by Vega's side as she appeared and taking her hand. She was in a poor state, but he held her up, ready to escort her to the Morales family. He knew better than anyone how much she had sacrificed to be with him, but given that he had failed, it was always possible that the Quarius family might try to target them again. His aura changed and he looked ahead with determination in his eyes. Chapter 2060. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:20 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 2060. Tension. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The tension in the air was high. The situation of Adworth and Lionel's battle was truly explosive, but after the shock that Aina had given them all, it was hard for the build up such shock once again. Instead, it felt like they were quickly growing numb. The only ones who seemed to have an exceptionally fierce reaction were individuals who had the most invested in Lionel's losses. The likes of Cross Elder Avon and Cynthia felt as though their hearts were being crushed every time Lionel did something that was out of their expectations. The last few hours had truly been an odd one to witness. The odd change in Lionel's demeanor made many feel as though he was finally succumbing to the pressure. With the largest challenges still looming over the horizon, there were many who would have crumbled beneath such a situation. So it didn't seem unbelievable for Lionel to have entered such a situation. But then Aina appeared and spun the situation around once again, and Lionel somehow came out even stronger than he had before, his dream force progressing once again, and his strength taking another major leap since the last time they had seen him. In just a bit over a week since the air wars had begun, they had witnessed Lionel progress from Tier 7 to Tier 8, and then to Tier 9. Then, as though he wasn't satisfied with just this alone, his control over his forces increased by leaps and bounds. It felt like every time he brought out another force technique, it would come from the top of his head, as though his forces were such an inseparable part of his body that commanding them was nothing different from second nature. This chapter upload first at NWSB. C0M Adworth was a genius that had been spoken about for a long time. There was no shortage of individuals that he would be on the same level as the Sword Deity and the Bow Deity if it wasn't for the fact he had to divert so much of his attention toward politics, and if he wasn't one of 7. The Sword Deity and Bow Deity were the only heirs of their families, while this was a title that Adworth shared with the other 6 Novas, and would continue to until the conclusion of the Air Wars. So to see him defeated by his youngest cousin made them feel as though they were dreaming. After all, Adworth was much older than Amory and Nazak, so his strength had had more time to develop. But the end result was still oh so clear for all of them to see. Now, this fallen First Nova stood in the face of the Quarius family, and none of the Morales ancestors seemed to have any intention of interfering. The rules of the Morales family were quite harsh most times. Maybe if First Nova had managed to claim heirship for himself, he could still command the lower-level Morales family members to act on his behalf, and thus ease the situation. But as a loser, he had no right to do such a thing. The Morales family had always been aware of their precarious situation in the human domain. It wasn't just them, but families on their level like the Oman family and the Seward family were also keenly aware of the politics surrounding their existence. These sorts of politics were even more important when it came to matters of marriage. I think you should take a look at even in the case that First Nova had become the heir, the ancestors still wouldn't have interfered in this matter. That was because their action could be seen as a forced assimilation of sorts. Vega was an incredibly important genius to the Aquarius family. She was easily the strongest genius of this generation that they had. Although she had lost to Aina, by now, many had begun to believe that it was only a matter of course. Aina was a life-grade force pill crafter. Who knew how she had modified her own body until now? Who knew how strong she truly was? Just because she had lost to Aina didn't mean that the Aquarius family felt that Vega was any less valuable. They hadn't been able to act before because Vega's appearance by First Nova's side had been far too shocking. Plus, there was probably some hope in their hearts that First Nova would end up as the final victor. There wasn't as united a front against the Morales as it seemed. For many powerful, but middle-of-the-pack families, this matter was less meaningful to them. The Seward and Oman families, not to mention the Void Palace, Shield Cross Stars and Spiritual Religion, or even the Constellation Bow Alliance, probably cared a great deal, but that was only because they stood at the same level as the Morales family. If the Morales family suddenly broke free of their stalemate and surged ahead, it would be they who suffered the most loss, or the greatest feeling of loss. But to these smaller families, not ultimately but at least relatively so, the winner of this battle of behemoths was less important to them. In fact, to the Aquarius family, First Nova's victory might have given them a reason to side with the Morales and gain the most advantages. Not only would First Nova's victory mean that Lionel had lost, and that the greatest reason for the opposition to the Morales would have vanished, but it would have also given them a direct line to one of the most powerful families of the human domain. It wasn't like women of the Aquarius family had never married men of the Morales. But whether it was situation or status, Adderworth would have been the greatest opportunity they ever received to advance further, something greatly difficult when you were already a family of their caliber and level. Every step forward as a family already near the pinnacle of the seventh dimension was incomparably difficult. But now all of that was worthless, and the more days passed, the more and more it seemed that Lionel might truly come out as the victor. If that happened, the Aquarius family would have no choice but to draw a strong line between themselves and the Morales, or else they might end up caught in the crossfire. So, the moment Vega appeared, the ancestor of the Aquarius family stepped forward, her wrinkles deepening as she frowned at the closeness of the two. Chapter 2061. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:26 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 2061. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Adderworth's frown deepened. Ancestor Aquarius had only taken a single step forward, and she hadn't even seemed to release her aura, but the pressure on him was considerable. His grip tightened slightly on Vega's hand. For the longest time, their relationship was entirely a secret, but that was mostly because Vega didn't want to outright accept his advances. She was focused on other things and didn't want to be distracted. She had always been a very serious woman, far more enamored with her own legacy and the history she would leave behind that even most men would be. Plus, due to the usual unspoken rules of the Air Wars, members of the Constellation families wouldn't participate regardless, so there was no need to talk about such things. But that was when everything changed. The Morales family was suddenly being pressured from all sides, and this silly girl, not wanting him to misunderstand her intentions, actually decisively abandoned her family all so that he wouldn't think that she had chosen her family over him. Ironically, if not for the pressure of outsiders, it might have taken several more decades for their relationship to reach this level. But now, It seemed that because of these very pressures, she might be ripped from him in the next moment. Vega weakly leaned onto Adderworth's shoulder, her breathing shallow. Breathing now felt like an incomparably difficult task, her breath coming in sharp whispers from time to time that sounded as though she was pulling air through her teeth, just to minimize the hurt in her chest. She slowly breathed in his scent, knowing very well that it would be the last time for a very long while. Not once did she consider the fact that it would be the last time indefinitely. If she was taken away today, then she would simply wait until she was powerful enough such that one in her family could command her any longer. She may very well be old and wrinkled by that point, but she hoped that Adderworth would still accept her. In truth, the reason that she had kept First Nova at bay for so long wasn't just due to her ambition. The women of the Quarius family had always fallen in love quite hard, and once that barrier was broken, it was difficult to bottle it up once again. It was said that the origin of the Quarius family's lineage factor was quite unique. Originally, at its lowest evolution, the strength of the Quarius family was only in their ability to be containers. They could store far more water in their bodies than normal people, allowing them to have access to a large story of water force whenever they wanted. It was a simple ability, one that couldn't be any more normal. It was simply known as the cupbearer lineage factor. However, the meaning of this name would change greatly when they appointed their history's first matriarch. It was said that in the hands of this matriarch, the meaning of cupbearer changed forever, and their lineage factor became a vessel of both water force and love. Of course, this was nothing more than a metaphor. In reality, what happened was that they gained the strength to pour their emotions into their cups. Akin to Lionel's king's might, they were able to greatly strengthen their forces by using their wills to influence their water force. After that day, the strength of the Quarius family soared by leaps and bounds, and eventually, they reached the status they held today. The more emotions they experienced, the more life experience they gained, the stronger the water force in their cup began. Eventually, it would reach a point where it overflowed. On this day, they would become an ancestor-level character, and the water force they could control would become the strongest in the human domain. However, because their emotions were stored in their cups like this, they felt and experienced emotions harder and more forcefully than almost any other population of people. Being afraid of the outcome of this, Vega had put up walls against Adderworth. Although it sounded like she would only become stronger the stronger her emotions became, there were many instances of Quarius family women dying due to their bodies being unable to handle the outflow of their cups. If they loved too hard too early, the only path left for them was death. At this moment, though, knowing that she would have to separate from Adderworth for so long, Vega felt like she was truly dying on the inside. Her water force was already stronger than most due to her talent. If it was also matched with the emotions she had been burying and refusing to face, she might die even quicker than others. I think you should take a look at, I'm sorry, Ada. I'm sorry. Adderworth, who was beading with sweat as he faced off against the stare of Ancestor Quarius, suddenly forgot about it all to comfort Vega. Vega, stop apologizing to me. It should be me protecting you, and I've failed. I swear that there will come a day when no one will be able to take you from me. I promise, I promise. Vega suddenly smiled weakly, her eyes still closed. Stupid Ada, I didn't mean that. I mean that I'm sorry I never gave you my body. I'm sorry that we never shared a bed, that I've never tasted your seed. I feel so regretful right now. So regretful that I wasn't able to experience such a thing with my love while still young. Adderworth froze, his face suddenly turning beet red. Sensing the rise in his body heat, Vega's giggle turned more charming. Others might think of Adderworth like this dauntless leader, but she knew the true him. This first Nova that everyone respected so much was truly too easily embarrassed. The frown of the ancestor deepened. The human domain was still a place that was quite harsh on the requirements for a woman's chastity. Vega saying these things before so many people was akin to outright ruining her opportunity to marry anyone else at the level of Adderworth in the future, except for Adderworth himself. But how could the Quarius family ever allow that? She realized that she had been too soft-hearted. She needed to take Vega away now before she said anything more. Ancestor Quarius reached forward, sending a powerful surge of water force. Sensing this chain, All the heat in Adworth's body turned frigid. Gritting his teeth, Adworth's aura pushed against the pressure as he retrieved his spear, his golden armor manifesting once more. Ancestor Quarius shook her head. She, along with everyone else, knew that it was a useless resistance. However, just before her water force reached Adworth, another powerful pressure descended, shattering her water force and causing her expression to change. There's no reason to separate such a young and budding couple, right? This sweet and soothing voice was entirely unfamiliar to many. The heads of many ancestors looked up, unable to find the location of this voice until they suddenly flickered into being under a swirl of green force. A woman with beauty that seemed to light up the starry skies appeared, her golden hair flowing and her piercing emerald eyes stirring their souls. But it was the man with the fawning expression behind her that left them entirely without words. Velasco and Eleanor Morales had appeared. Chapter 2062. Published at 7th of August, 2023, 1:26 and 47 seconds p.m. Chapter 2062. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A sudden silence fell. Velasco hadn't appeared personally for any major event in too long. And even when he did, it was only a clone of his. But the ancestors here were all too certain that this was the real Velasco, whether it was the aura, the casual dominance, and that sort of unapproachable smile that felt far more manufactured than real. Each part was as real as it got. This very Velasco they could hardly take their eyes off of stood behind a woman, as though he was content to let her lead. It was truly a woman with beauty beyond words, but it was also a beauty they knew far too little about. From their understanding, Velasco had always been a playboy. The number of women that had been ruined by him were far too many to count. He simply wasn't the type of man who would fall head over heels the moment he saw a beauty. And while Eleanor was objectively a woman of great looks, it wasn't to the point where there were no others who could be said to be in the same league as her. The human domain had trillions upon trillions of people. Among them, there were hundreds of women with beauty that could take one's breath away. It was the reason the Queen Beauty rankings had been made in the first place. So the question was, why her? It was a question that had been in the back of their minds for the longest time, but no matter how they looked at it, the gap between Velasco and Eleanor was enormous. Was it truly just a matter of Velasco taking a fancy to the type of person she was? Maybe that would be an acceptable answer if there wasn't so much understanding of Velasco's personality amidst the masses. He was a man who cared for little other than himself. Even when his father died and he went on a rampage, many had painted such a foul image of Velasco in their mind that rumors that he had been more pissed off by someone close to him being so weak than the actual death of Lionel's grandfather. Of course, this matter was only exaggerated, but it went to show the kind of public perception many had of Velasco. He was a genius crafter who had created all sorts of blueprints that could change the very fate of the human domain, or at least the Morales family on the smallest scale, but he had never shared them. He was the greatest talent in the history of the Morales and could have led them to new heights. But he disdained being a leader of people so much that he refused to even participate in the air wars. His relationship with his own brother was strained precisely because he never gave their father his due respect. He shunned the way of the spear that Ishmael had painstakingly created. He didn't care to use the spear domain ring. He seemed to constantly be going out of his way to take a different path from everyone else, all so that he could prove that he didn't need anyone else to be number one. I think you should take a look at this was the level of arrogance this man had. An arrogance that wasn't swayed by beauty in the slightest. Even when Cynthia Oman waited for him silently in a wedding dress, prepared to spend the rest of her life with him, he hadn't said a word and simply never appeared. He had let the woman that was the apple in everyone's eye, the number one woman in the eyes of too many to count, sit in her own self-pity for decades without a single word. But now, this very same man stood behind an unknown figure with a fawning expression, so sweet that it could make a single man puke and a single woman twist her face with unhappiness. He was truly whipped to the greatest of degrees, and it didn't seem to compute to many. Until just now. The green force around Eleanor slowly faded as she stood in the skies, her green robes fluttering. Looking into her eyes, one could feel the echo of a dragon in their souls. She was such a petite woman, and yet her presence seemed so impossibly large. Those of the Void Palace that were vaguely familiar with this woman couldn't quite understand this change. Alienor had spent decades in the Void Palace, so why was it that she wasn't more famous than this? Why was her light so shrouded until this moment? What these individuals didn't understand is that of those decades Alienor had spent in the Void Palace, the vast majority of them were spent with more than 99% of her talent sealed. With Earth having yet to complete its metamorphosis, and her world spirit still in a deep slumber, she was incredibly limited. The only thing she had to lean upon was her own intelligence and the Luxnix family's lineage factor, a talent that was only of the 6th dimension. It could be said that the fact she made it to the status of a sector-ranked disciple, while so suppressed, was an incredibly shocking fact. This suppression had lasted up until just 2 or 3 years before Lionel himself entered the Void Palace. But after the metamorphosis descended and Earth officially entered the 4th dimension, those shackles began to loosen. Not only did she finally gain access to her Emperor's Might lineage factor, but the remaining shackles on her affinities, not to mention her world spirit, were all released. She returned from the Cataclysm Zone just over 10 or so years ago, being among the middle of the pack. But just like this, in barely 10 years, she went from barely in the 7th dimension to an ancestor-level character. When those below began to do the math in their head, they froze. Right now, Alienor. Wasn't she just barely over 80 years old? An ancestor-level character, who wasn't even 100 years old? Didn't that mean that if she had wanted to, no one could stop her from participating in these air wars? Chapter 2063. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2063. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2063. Morsel Prev. Chapter The human domain was shaken once more. When they heard about Alienor kicking Shield Cross stars out of Earth's territory, they had assumed that this was just a wife relying on her husband's prestige. This wasn't something they would look down on her for. After all, if Alienor couldn't rely on Velasco's prestige, then who could? However, this event wasn't enough for many to change their opinions of her. In addition to this, not many knew of the losses Shield Cross stars had been forced to suffer at the hands of Lionel. After all, Shield Cross stars would do their best to keep this a secret, and without them in the territory, how could information be so easily passed out to others? Now, however, many had a completely different outlook on things. It wasn't that many hadn't considered the idea that Velasco had been the reason for Alienor's sudden rise, but if it was so easy to bring people up to the 8th dimension, wouldn't there be millions more ancestors? Whether it was conventional path or God path existence, the number of ancestors was far too few. So few, in fact, that even these powerful families usually only had just 1 or 2. It was only existences on the level of the Morales or Seward families that would have dozens to their name, but even then it couldn't be counted in the hundreds. This didn't even mention the fact that Alienor had very clearly used the God path. Although it was extremely difficult to reach the 8th dimension with the conventional path, it was still far more difficult with the God path. In addition, when you used the latter path, expecting to simply gain help from others was foolhardy. The God path relied only on self-comprehension, and though resources could still be valuable, they would only be supplemental and not fundamental. All of this only meant one thing. Alienor had managed to reach this stage on her own. She was practically a member of the younger generation, and by the crudest and most direct definition, that was exactly what she was. And yet, she had already stepped out and onto such a stage. At that moment, without any boasting or even arrogance, Alienor had instantly skyrocketed in the placement of the hearts of many, so much so that many couldn't help but look over toward Cynthia as though to gauge her inner thoughts. Cynthia was looking toward the duo in the skies just the same as everyone else. She didn't turn away as though to pretend she was indifferent, nor did she seem too eager to look at them either. She expertly fit in, doing the same as others without even the slightest hint of deviation. Those that silently observed her couldn't help but praise in their hearts. There weren't many people who could do such a thing. It could be said that her mental fortitude was on a level all to its own. There was one person, though, who couldn't seem to react like everyone else, and that was Ancestor Aquarius herself. She took a step back, her face slightly paling. Eleanor hadn't actually attacked her directly, but the sudden vanishing of her force left her feeling extremely uncomfortable. It felt as though a phantom limb of sorts had suddenly been ripped from her, leaving behind a phantom pain. Quickly regaining her bearings, Ancestor Aquarius looked up with a hint of wariness in her eyes. This is a matter of the Aquarius family. Is the Morales family insistent on stepping into this matter? I think you should take a look at this old woman was actually quite smart. She took the best approach immediately. By tying Eleanor's actions with that of the Morales family, and not allowing her to be an independent party, she would definitely have to rethink her will to take action once again. Adworth, who had been ready to go all out just now, was taken off guard by the change. He didn't know who Eleanor was immediately, but he definitely knew Velasco, so he put two and two together. Seeing the situation turning bad, he grit his teeth. I am willing to separate from the Morales family entirely. Auntie, I really can't win this battle, but I can't ask you to take on such a risk easily. Is it possible to send the two of us away from here? I will handle the rest. Eleanor, who had been about to respond, looked down toward Adworth with a sweet smile. There's no need to worry about this matter. I've been greatly unsatisfied with the matters of the human domain for a very long time already. So what if I piss some people off? Despite her smile, the words that came from Eleanor were actually quite crude, but many had no idea that this was just the tip of the iceberg and were entirely taken off guard when she spoke again. Looking back toward the old woman, she sneered. And so what if they are? What are you going to do about it, exactly? Ancestor Aquarius' eyes opened wide. You. She had barely gotten her words out when Eleanor struck out with a palm. Ancestor Aquarius was squarely hit in the chest, her seemingly frail body spinning out of control and being sent tumbling back. She tore a hole through the hull of the Aquarius family's flagship, causing it to rumble and begin to slowly fall out of the skies. Eleanor's gaze turned murderous as she stood tall and proud in the skies. The next person that suggests I or the territory of Earth is a pawn of the Morales won't just be blasted away by a palm of mine. I will directly kill them no matter who they are. You've all been quite comfortable, making assumptions, jumping to conclusions, painting up fanciful tales you can use as an excuse to try and con your way into gaining the benefits you want while simultaneously upholding the moral high ground. I'm here to tell you all today that Earth isn't a pawn on your board, nor is it a morsel of meat you can eat whenever you please. Earth has its own powerhouses and it knows how to bite back. Chapter 2064. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2064. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2060. For the first prev chapter, Eleanor's words left them absolutely stunned. Indeed, she wasn't lying. Eleanor's temper was quite fiery, and her patience had always been extremely limited. She didn't even have much patience for her own husband. The only person in this world that could make her slow down was her own son, and no one else. Up until this point, she hadn't been able to say anything because she had been too far away, but she had long been dissatisfied with how the human domain was trying to coddle Earth as though it was a child that couldn't take a single step without their input. Did they even have any idea how powerful her father was? Did they have any idea how much more powerful than even that he was within the limits of Earth's territory? More importantly, did they look down on her that much? Apparently, she had been far too low-key. As powerful as she was here and now, she was easily tens of times more powerful within Earth's territory as well. Not only because of her emperor's might, but because of her world spirit being allowed to unleash its truest and fullest strength. Just with the existence of the two of them, they were on par with any of the constellation families. They weren't some meat primed and ready on the chopping board. But she realized that she had indeed been too silent on the matter. Another reason she had boldly kicked Shield Cross stars out of their territory, other than because she was enraged about their treatment of her son, was to make a point. But clearly, her point hadn't been made well enough. So she decided to make it again. This time, she would be even clearer. In truth, though, Eleanor had probably just saved that woman's life, because she had already sensed Velasco shifting to her back. Velasco wasn't a fan of anyone refuting himself, let alone refuting his wife. The moment anyone tried to disrespect him, he would have already retaliated. He didn't like explaining himself. His fist was the best explanation most could hope for. They could ask the spirits on the other side if they had any idea about why they had died. The silence was palpable. Eleanor looked back toward Atterworth and smiled. No need to worry, just go back to the Morales flagship. I doubt there will be anyone of the Quarius family waiting to cause trouble for you. First Nova blinked in surprise but then nodded solemnly. At the moment he was in shock. No one had ever heard of a youth having two ancestor parents. Maybe it had happened, but by the time that was true, the child would have probably reached the pinnacle of the seventh dimension already and have been old and wizened. But Lionel suddenly had not just one parent, but two in that realm, and he hadn't even entered the seventh dimension yet. At this point it all felt like a joke. Were they really going to use these air wars to kill Lionel? It was easy to explain away Velasco's personality while he wasn't here. After all, he was well known to be quite cruel, and so long as his son was killed by a member of the same generation, it was unlikely that he would lash out in anger. But with the man actually here, those that had been so confident were instantly hesitant. They remembered Velasco cutting off Rosen's arm back then, strutting into the Void Palace despite his ban, and exacting justice for his son without a word. Would he do that again? Technically, Rosen had been far above his son's level, but it wasn't like Rosen had acted directly. He had just facilitated the event that put Lionel in danger. Wasn't that what they were doing right this moment? And now there was Eleanor. She was clearly far more powerful than any of them had imagined. Although Ancestor Quarius wasn't exactly a powerhouse amongst ancestors, she was still an ancestor. There were too few who could defeat her so easily. And clearly, Eleanor was the far more protective type. Even if Eleanor didn't have the strength personally, considering how much Velasco doted on her, didn't that mean that she could make him act even when he normally wouldn't? I think you should take a look at suddenly. Many felt that this matter wasn't well thought out enough. It was easy to believe that they were equipped to deal with Velasco when he wasn't present, but it seemed that they had taken the presence of his clone to be the cap of his true strength. It was only now that he was before them that they truly felt the vastness of his aura. Those below the eighth dimension couldn't sense it at all, but the current Velasco was akin to a bottomless ocean. His aura was larger than that of even the solar system they stood within, as though so long as they were within this countless light-year span, he could kill them with a thought. However, what no one expected was that at that moment, the silent Cynthia, who didn't seem intent on interfering, suddenly did. So that's it? Because you say so it is? The words were light and unhurried. They didn't seem like they should have had a strong impact, but they were resoundingly true. If the Morales and Earth were really in cahoots, why would Earth be the one to confirm it? In fact, they would probably say exactly what Eleanor was saying right now. Her words truly didn't prove much of anything. I seem to remember quite well that, in all his arrogance, Velasco forewent force pill crafting because he didn't believe that he needed another discipline to be able to change the fates of people. I heard that the Morales family's sixth door appeared not long ago, and now you've appeared. It would seem that he had succeeded. Cynthia's voice continued unhurried, her casual words revealing secrets that the Morales had held tightly for countless generations. In one breath, she warned the Morales that she knew more than they thought, and on the other, she had shrouded Eleanor's shine and given all the credit to Velasco. One would expect Eleanor to refute, to deny. However, her gaze only shifted over to Cynthia for the first time quite calmly. Her green force suddenly appeared once more as her aura began to rise, growing to the point that even breathing seemed impossible. You'll be the first. She had already said it quite clearly. Whoever claimed Earth to be a pawn would die. Eleanor suddenly vanished. When she appeared again, she already stood before Cynthia, her golden hair fluttering wildly. Bang! No one saw how she attacked. Cynthia was sent flying into the distance, disappearing amongst the stars. Chapter 2065. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2065. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2065. Emerald Prev. Chapter. Eleanor walked forward with light steps. One would have never thought that she had stepped onto the Omen family's flagship. The Omen were among the most powerful families of the human domain. In terms of influence, they might very well be number one. And yet none of that seemed to matter in the slightest. The green force around Eleanor suddenly solidified. A snaking dragon with jade horns opened its jaws and roared, the shuddering echo ripping the flagship to pieces as she continued to walk forward. A shocking realization seemed to have entered all of their hearts at once. Did she destroy the ship, so that she didn't have to change the direction of her steps? This understanding caused their hearts to quake. It was the sort of indifferent and casual power that existed on a plane all to its own. Bang! A streak came over from the distance. As far back as Cynthia was thrown, she seemed to have recovered just as quickly, returning with a countless number of rings hovering around her. Each exuded the power of a life-grade treasure, reflecting a silvery hue that sparkled like the stars in the distance. The rings rippled, a sharp echo of what felt like blade force and yet was simultaneously entirely different forming. The coldness on Cynthia's expression was all-pervading, the indifference vanishing in the place of a smoldering hatred. Without a word, Cynthia's palms struck forward. Space cracked and her rings rushed forward, each carrying the sharpness of an ancient, tempered blade. Eleanor's indifference, though, remained just the same. Her palms struck out a moment later, meeting in the surging force in a surprisingly silent clash. With her other hand, she pressed out her forefinger several times, forming dozens of gorgeous greenish rainbow bubbles in what felt like an instant. These bubbles floated slowly, but they somehow intercepted the quickly moving rings surging toward her without much effort at all. The rings were suddenly enveloped, the seemingly fragile bubbles hardly quivering in the face of their sharpness and might. They came to a halt, unable to move forward at all. But what happened next was even more shocking than that. They began to corrode one after another, and in the blink of an eye, they fell into a pile of rust and ashes. Only then did the bubble finally pop, releasing their contents into the endless void. Eleanor continued to walk forward unhurriedly, her emerald dragon wrapped around her, its menacing roar echoing against and again. The pressure it exuded only continued to increase, until Eleanor suddenly struck out with another palm. The emerald dragon shot toward the stunned Cynthia. She hurried to defend, blocking her front with the rings she had remaining. She just couldn't believe that her self-created weapons had had such a horrible and sudden ending. They were all forged with 8th-dimensional materials, and were forged to the standard of the life grade. In addition, they had a symbiotic characteristic that came with them being in a set. As such, they could work independently, and also share power between one of them. Destroying one of them should have been as difficult as destroying the whole set. But somehow, the moment they entered Eleanor's bubble, their connection to the outside world had entirely vanished, and yet Cynthia hadn't sensed any sort of powerful spatial force coming from Eleanor at all. I think you should take a look at, but it was already too late to try and figure out what would happen. Bang! Cynthia shot back like a rocket once again. This time, blood flew from her lips as the rings she used to defend cracked beneath the pressure. Looking into the eyes of the roaring emerald dragon looming over her, she felt her heart shake, her coldness cracking to reveal a hint of doubt and even fear. Those eyes. They didn't look fake in the slightest. It was as though the real creature was looming over her. Cynthia coughed out another mouthful of blood, drenching her once pristine robes. Seeing this scene, many who had thought that she would be able to hold out on her own were both shocked and growing hesitant. The ancestors of the Omen family who had finally finished saving those that remained within the flagship were quick to check on the situation. But just as they wanted to help, a cold shiver spiked down their spines. Velasco hadn't said anything, he hadn't even looked at them, and yet it was as though the voice of the universe had whispered a warning into their ears, putting a stranglehold on their thoughts. He was truly a madman. If they stepped out of line, he really wouldn't care to wipe them all off the face of existence. Eleanor continued to walk forward, her steps light and unhurried. She reached out a hand and the dragon in the distance rushed back toward her, shrinking until it formed an elegant 11-inch emerald wand with a dragon wrapped around it. She tapped at the air, and a rush of wind force formed. She tapped again, and a searing heat threatened to burn a layer of their skin off. She tapped again, and the skies rumbled with lightning force, and she tapped again, causing a rippling wave of water force to rise. Countless complex force arcs formed in the starry skies, forming into groups of 4 green, red, golden, and blue. They shuddered, fusing into one and beginning to rotate. Cynthia, who had finally stopped flying in the distance, slowly turned to face this sight. It felt as though the stars had all been replaced by these formations, as though the only light left in the universe was the very woman before her, and the wand in her hand. Eleanor's delicate wrist flickered, drawing an arc through the skies as she pressed down. The rotating force arcs came to a trembling stop, and the world fell silent for just a split moment before what could only be described as an Armageddon was unleashed. Spiraling bolts of fire wrapped in wind, lightning, and water surged forward. Cynthia was swallowed from all sides. The last image those around saw was the helplessness in her eyes before she was buried beneath the cacophonic rumble. Chapter 2066. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2066. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2066. Hush Prev. Chapter A. Hushed silence fell. It was hard to accept. Had such a genius fallen just like that? Cynthia Oman had been part of their lives for all too long. Even weak sixth-dimensional families had heard of her name before. The ancestors of the Oman family looked as though they had lost their souls. She was supposed to be the future of their family. She was the most talented force crafter and force pill crafter in their history, but not only that, her combat prowess was exceptional. She simply had no weaknesses. It was difficult to accept. Their eyes couldn't help but go red. And yet none of them dared to move all the same. The Morales ancestors didn't know what to say about this matter either. They hadn't thought that this family of 3 would all be madmen. Velasco had already painted his own legend, and then Lionel seemed to have begun to draw his. Then there was Eleanor, who was a complete unknown until this moment. Eleanor turned back with an unmoved expression on her face. In her opinion, she had simply followed through on what she had said would happen. As for the matters of Cynthia and her husband, she had never really thought about them. Velasco had never said anything about it, so she didn't feel the need to care. In the end, was there a need to think about someone who had already lost to her? Others might have tried to make it out to be some sort of rivalry between them. They might have even said that she didn't stand a chance against the likes of Cynthia. But she had never taken this very seriously. If it wasn't for Cynthia ignoring her words, she wouldn't have even cared to look at this woman, let alone attack to kill her. She had simply been beneath her notice. There was a point in Eleanor's life where she hadn't believed that she would ever get married because she found all the men around her to be simply too insignificant. Of course, this wasn't part of the story she had told Lionel about how she had met his father. It could be said that she was exceedingly arrogant. Emperor Fox was so fond of her character that he had already chosen her to succeed him as opposed to her elder brother. Others might not be aware of her character, but they would be now. She was a woman who said what she meant and did as she said. Her patience was limited, her fuse was short, and she didn't have time for those that would disrespect her. The reason she was so enraged by others believing Earth to be a pawn was because it made it sound as though she, Eleanor Morales, was a woman who could simply be wooed by a man who wanted her for nothing more than her womb. It assumed that she was a chess piece, one that existed for the sole reason of giving birth to Lionel, so that the Morales might have a legitimate reason for taking over Earth under the eyes of the human domain. It wasn't the accusations themselves, but rather the underlying meaning that completely and totally infuriated her. Did she look like a woman who could be so easily controlled? Did her womb exist to be used for any purpose but her own? How dare they? The more Eleanor thought about it, the more enraged she seemed to become. All of you scram out of my sight. She looked toward the elders of the Oman family that remained. If you insist on staying, don't blame me for continuing my slaughter. The expressions of the Oman family elders all became ugly. Eleanor might have defeated Cynthia, but there was still an ample gap between Cynthia and the rest of them. Even if she had won that battle, She shouldn't speak with them so casually. Eleanor's gaze flashed with a dangerous light when it seemed that they were dissatisfied. The force around her seemed to go out of control, and elements of all kinds seemed to warp and form around her. Volcanic fire form, raging water force, thunderous lightning, whipping wind force, rumbling earth force. I think you should take a look at an endless number of types of elemental forces took shape in the surrounding. Each one as powerful as the last and not one losing out to the other. It was as though there wasn't a force she couldn't control. And to some extent, that was very much true. In this world, there wasn't an elemental force in existence that Eleanor could not use. Her affinity for each and everyone couldn't even be scaled properly. And when she was enraged, the world reacted. Emperor's Edict. A violent swirl of dream force surged out in all directions, forming a bubble that expanded for thousands of kilometers. I said scram. The Omen ancestors felt a shuddering force collapse around them, and under the eyes of all those present, they suddenly vanished. They were entirely unable to resist. Eleanor felt slightly better now, as though she didn't just want to slap Cynthia's face into the afterlife, but to also disrespect her family after she was already gone as well. Only now did her indifference fade into another smile. Suddenly, a shadow appeared before her, but it was only Velasco. He brought out a handkerchief and began to pat away non-existent sweat from Eleanor's brow. Eleanor couldn't help but roll her eyes. What was this man always doing? Even so, the smile in her eyes was quite clear. Don't overexert yourself for such people. Can't you just let me handle such things? Eleanor pursed her lips. You never do things right. If it was up to you, my son would still be a fugitive. Velasco grinned. Let that brat suffer a bit. What did you say about my son? Nothing. It must have been the wind, dear. Do you want a shoulder massage? You look a little tense. Velasco shifted to Eleanor's back and began to diligently massage her. He truly looked like a dutiful worker bee. Eleanor's gaze shifted and landed on Cross Elder Avon. Speaking of her son being a fugitive, she suddenly remembered who was responsible for that. Chapter 2067. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2067. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2067. Heavy Prev. Chapter. Cross Elder Avon's mustache bristled under his hot breath. This situation wasn't one he liked in the slightest. He had already been suppressed by Lionel's words earlier, but watching his mother and father now, he felt like dealing with this kid was getting further and further away from him. Seeing that his mother suddenly looked toward him, his brows couldn't help but furrow. He didn't take this woman's strength seriously. He stood atop the human domain in terms of strength, a status he shared with very, very few others. Although she had sent those elders of the Omen family away, that matter wasn't as simple as it seemed. For one, it was a technique they hadn't been experienced with or ready to deal with. Plus, there was the factor of Velasco's gaze. They hadn't even dared to fight back. But he wasn't so easy to deal with, nor did he feel like he had to give Velasco so much face. The Omen family wasn't very well known for their combat strength, but all Shield Cross stars did was fight. He had walked through countless bloody battles and corpses to make it to his current stage of life. He wasn't the kind of existence that others could casually hope to deal with a few glances and a beautiful face. So he stared back, his temper threatening to spiral out of control more and more with every passing moment. He didn't look like he had a single care in the world left. Even if the subordinates he had brought with him died, he simply couldn't be bothered to care. But to his surprise, after giving him what looked to be a gaze of warning, Eleanor looked away without another word. She fluttered in the starry skies, seemingly about to land on the Morales flagship. Hey, how could my wife sit on such a dingy vessel? Velasco snorted. The lips of the Morales ancestors twitched. Dingy? This flagship was on the same level as Shield Cross Star's best flagships. In fact, it was actually a level better. They were a force-crafting family after all. There was no one in the human domain that could match up to their flagships. This sort of vessel could wipe out a solar system with a single casual fart. What part of it was dingy? Velasco waved a hand, and an enormous boat appeared. It was sleek in silver, and truly built like a vessel more deserving of the ocean's waves than the starry skies. But even so, it was gorgeous and pleasing to the eyes. However, when it touched down, the hearts of the Morales ancestors shuddered. That was because they felt the surrounding space ripple, as though it was truly touching the surface of the water. They had never seen such a thing in their lives. Just the implications were enough to leave them in stunned silence. The transition was absolutely seamless, and the distortions calmed a moment later. However, the image of space rippling couldn't leave their minds. It was clear that this vessel was surfing on air. It was surfing on the bounds of reality itself. But it didn't make any sense. Ripping through space should have been a forceful thing. Even if you had a spatial force affinity, a high one at that, it would take a large amount of it to cross through space. And to just soak in it like this, it would take a continuous output of a steady stream of energy. But they couldn't feel any of that. It was like this boat was simply in tune with the fabric of reality, being able to touch upon it whenever it wanted and gathering power from it. This was no different than the strength of a god, but Velasco had casually taken such a thing out for no other reason than to please his wife. I think you should take a look. Otmani had only heard legends of Velasco. They felt that the importance of elders who had lived far longer than him placed on him was far too much. They thought that some legends were exaggerated, that the real thing couldn't possibly match up to the fanciful stories. But for those who understood even a little bit about force crafting, they came to realize that maybe these stories weren't exaggerated enough. Just this boat alone was enough for Velasco to claim to be unmatched in force crafting. There was simply no one that was his equal. Velasco and Eleanor took a calm seat in the silver boat, looking forward toward the glass cube below. However, after a few seconds, Velasco leaned his back and closed his eyes. His glasses darkened and shaded his eyes from lights before the sound of a gentle snore began to echo through the now silent starry skies. Eleanor shook her head, but she didn't disturb her husband. Compared to Velasco, though, the gaze she looked toward the glass cube with was full of fervor and love. It was clear to everyone without guessing who she was observing. Who else could deserve such a gaze from a mother, if not her own child? The atmosphere seemed to calm down, but the last moments of Cynthia, the disrespect of the Omen family, and the destruction of the Quarius family's flagship seemed to continuously replay in their minds. While everything seemed to have come to an end, the brewing undercurrents only seemed to be getting more and more volatile. The surface was calm, but anyone diving deep would find themselves pinned down, unable to resurface. The implications of the appearance of Eleanor and Velasco were extraordinarily heavy. Lionel looked up into the skies, not quite knowing what was happening, but feeling an odd feeling in his heart. The battle of eighth-dimensional existences would definitely ripple down here, although it would be greatly muted. Most wouldn't be able to sense it, but he definitely had. After a moment he smiled, then his smile turned into a grin. He looked back down, swiftly claiming the city. Then, he triggered the final air grade upgrade challenge. It was about time he claimed this final C4. Chapter 2068. Published at 9th of August, 2023, 7:34 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2068. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2068. Best option? Previous chapter. This air grade upgrade was probably the easiest of them all. The defenses of this city were far more useful than even the water lotus territory. The whirlpools forward the waves of oceanic beasts to split before they could reach the city, and funneled them into concentrated lines that the stingrays were more than equipped to handle. At the same time, the stormy skies above made it so that the attacks of the Skies family were even more devastating, amplifying them to a new degree. First Nova could only shake his head as he watched this. He had been so cautiously preparing for his first air grade upgrade despite the fact he had tens of times the number of people in comparison to Lionel under his command. And yet Lionel, with just barely over 1 million subordinates, much of which were untamed beasts, was actually crushing such a challenge right before his eyes. He realized, though, that even if another person had this exact same setup, it would have been impossible for them to accomplish what Lionel had. Even setting aside the life-grade armors all of those stingrays were wearing, just the seamless commanding of them was on another level entirely. It was clear that Lionel wasn't just an excellent force crafter, but he was a commander the likes of which First Nova had simply never seen before. Soon, the battle came to an end, and Lionel gave everyone a rest. This might very well be the last opportunity they received to have such a thing. But as this was happening, in the various circles of the Nightside supercontinent, there was an uproar. The first reason for this was because First Nova had suddenly disappeared, not just him but the whole of his subordinates as well. There were only two explanations for this: either it was a ploy on his part, or the more likely explanation. He had lost to someone, and he was forced to use his badge to vanish, resulting in all of his subordinates being teleported out as well. This was an almost unacceptable reality for many. It had happened too quickly, and far too silently. Was it an assassin? Did they have to be cautious against such a person? What was happening exactly? But this shock was only compounded by the matter that happened not long afterward. With the claiming of the fourth and final sea, Lionel had suddenly become the owner of the entire ocean. But this was only a small matter, mostly because no one was even aware that this had happened, at least not any still in the air wars. What was more important was that the last of the territories within the ocean had been unceremoniously booted out. Lionel had crushed the dreams of anyone who had planned to expand into the ocean. All of the work they had put in, and all the effort they had diverted from their main territories, was all laid to waste. For Orinik, because there was still a sea that remained unclaimed, his territory was pushed out to an unclaimed sea. But now that Lionel owned all four seas, the territories that remained and the ones that had been previously pushed away were destroyed entirely, leaving them in waste. With these two pieces of news descending one after another, it was hard to know exactly how to react. None of them could seem to understand what had happened, and the wariness they had toward their neighbors grew. How could they conclude that a single person had already claimed all four seas for themselves? Instead, they believed that four different territories had succeeded in forming air-grade territories before them. I think you should take a look at this conclusion was asinine to many of them, but they believed that the simplest answer was already the truest answer. The idea that one person could accomplish all of this on their own was most definitely not the simplest answer. The hoops one would have to jump through to accept such a thing were far too numerous. Ironically, because of this conclusion, despite a juicy piece of meat like Adderworth's territories being on the chopping block right before them all, no one dared to move rashly, and there happened to be a person who knew that exactly this would happen. Lionel's grasp of human nature was quite excellent, and thanks to the Umber family members, his comprehension of the goings-on of the Nightside supercontinent were deeper than most would know. As such, not only did he act upon this moment of caution by everyone else, he capitalized on it. Before the Nightside powers could react, Lionel had taken over Adderworth's territory silently and seamlessly, using all of the points he had just gathered from his last two air-grade upgrades to outfit the large region with a complex network of outposts. Once this was complete, Lionel calmed and took his time. Now, it didn't matter when they realized that the ownership of this land had been changed. In fact, if they took too long, it might very well be too late. Lionel stood in silence near the coastline. This was Adderworth's main city, and it was located on the waterline just like Lionel's original territory had been. Out in the sea, several rain beasts floated in silence. Because they had sent these rain beasts in using a loophole, just like the Leo family of before with their seventh-dimensional beasts, they were left behind even after their badges were cracked. As such, ever since the end of that battle, Lionel had had access to them. The trouble was that directing them wasn't as easy as it was the stingrays. The stingrays were a reward, and as such, they were designed to follow his orders. However, these rain beasts were independent creatures. Although they were docile, their intelligence was low. They were only able to understand the direction Richard had given them, so it wasn't convenient to use them. As a result, until now they had just been lingering around, unused. Lionel stood in silence, staring at them. What his best option here? Chapter 2069. Published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 2069. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in silence. There were only two options before him. The first was to abandon these creations entirely, or find an easy and quick method to make use of them. The reality was that he didn't have much time. Very soon, others would realize that he had taken over Adderworth's territories, and in addition to this, they would very soon begin to probe him and likely attack him. By Lionel's estimation, he probably only had half a day at best to figure something out, probably even less than that if he was honest. If he couldn't do something proper, then it would probably be best if he didn't do anything at all. Having a variable on the battlefield that he couldn't properly control would be more of a detriment than anything else. The first option he thought of was to just use an exceptionally crude method. He could make these beasts carry a large amount of water toward the territories of the other heirs, and then directly flood them. The method was the easiest and Lionel wouldn't have to do much of any preparation. However, it was an extremely weak method as well. For one, he was facing off against seventh-dimensional existences, not mortals. If he used this method on a third-dimensional world, the devastation was obvious. People would die both from the water and the collapsing buildings. He probably wouldn't have to lift even a single finger. But setting aside the buildings would even be so vulnerable here. Even if they were buried into kilometers of water and couldn't breathe for hours, or were crushed by millions of kilograms of weight. Would that really kill a seventh-dimensional genius? The unfortunate answer was probably not. If Lionel could guarantee it would shatter their city walls, at least it would be useful. But he wasn't sure of even that. Gold-grade cities were exceptionally sturdy at this point, and many would have built up extra defenses by not in preparation for the air-grade upgrade challenge. This did even mention the other issue of actually transporting these rain beasts. They moved exceptionally slowly, and they were huge targets from a distance. They would need escort and protection, and hiding them would be impossible. If he targeted others, it still might work since they didn't know what the rain beasts were, and they might take precautions that were inappropriate. But this would never work against Zavnik, who knew exactly what they were, and more likely than not, they wouldn't work against the ignorant either. This problem of speed and transport would likely be a problem no matter what options he chose. The rain beasts simply took too long to absorb water, and they were languid, low IQ beasts without much intelligence. Everything about them was annoying to deal with. It was a bit better on the ocean's waters where they held a great advantage. But now that they were on land, unless Lionel wanted to take the roundabout, the longest way through the ocean, those advantages were entirely useless. And even if he was willing to do that, not all of his enemies would be able to be sniped down from the coast. Lionel flipped a palm and a small rain beast appeared. This was the same rain beast that he had extracted all the water from previously. After a moment, he enveloped it in his dream world, and began to scan every corner of its body. Soon, a diagram of it appeared before him, formed of emulation spatial force. He began to spin it apart in his mind, dissecting it and separating it into pieces. "Aina," Lionel said lightly. "I think you should take a look at." Aina didn't take long to appear. When it came to matters like this, Aina was definitely the far better of the two. She had a natural inclination toward understanding what she should and shouldn't put in her body, and that gave her an intimate understanding of both force herbs and force-wielding creatures. "What do you think?" Lionel asked. "Is it possible to force it to take on water at a great speed? If that's possible, we could shrink them for easy transport, and then pump them with water suddenly when we're in enemy territory. It wouldn't be the most efficient thing, but it might be the best option we have." Aina blinked. Their bodies are weird. Logically, if they can grow from the size of a palm to kilometers in length, then their elasticity has to be great. But from what I can see, their elasticity is actually on a gradient. The more water they absorb, the more of those special proteins that they produce, increasing the elasticity of their bodies and allowing them to expand in size. It's probably less accurate to say that they have an ability to absorb water, and more accurate to say that water is the only thing they can absorb that's able to both trigger their protein synthesis, and is likewise benign enough that it doesn't poison them in the process. So you mean to say that it could theoretically absorb anything? Aina nodded. That would be its lineage factor, its ability to expand. It's not much unlike Noah's ability index, But the difference is that Noah can control his own synthesis, and he also has the ability to change the structure of his body to make it sturdier and more powerful. These aren't things that this rain beast is capable of doing. It could be said that they have a greatly simplified version of Noah's ability index. But their capacity for expansion is much larger and requires much less energy at the same time, although it takes a great period of time for them to reach that state. Lionel fell into his thoughts. This was very fascinating. And what about this rain beast right now? I only just extracted all the water from its body maybe a day or so ago. How long does it take for the extra elasticity it's gained to disappear? Aina's eyes lit up with understanding as though she had just pieced something together. So that's why. Yes, it's able to retain some of its elasticity even now, but it's probably lost about 50% of its original capability already. If you wait another day, it will take an extremely long time for it to build it back up again. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Chapter 2070, published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 2070. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It seemed that there was a chance that this would work, but it wasn't perfect either. There were still many issues to fix. For example, how would he transfer such a large amount of water? How would he feed it into the rain beasts? It wasn't like his enemies would give him as much time as he wanted. The methods had to be seamless and extremely quick. But if it couldn't accomplish that, then it was all useless, and once again, he might as well give up these beasts entirely. He had a solution for the water problem. Thanks to Kira, he still had an ocean's drop vial that could hold an ocean's worth of liquid within. It had once held the blood of a void beast, but now it was empty after it was entirely swallowed up by Little Blackstar. It was a simple matter to use it. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flashed. That was right. He had once used that vial to transfer golden-scaled koi fish around. It was the perfect solution for this. In fact, at the moment, it was filled to the brim with cleansing waters. Considering the current segmented cube, accumulating such a large amount of cleansing waters was child's play. Obviously, the segmented cube itself could be used for such transfer, but Lionel didn't want to use it for a very good reason. Even the Morales weren't aware of the limits of this treasure. It was clear that his father and grandfather had never disclosed these matters. For one, Lionel felt that there was a reason for this. The more he learned about the segmented cube, the more he understood it was no normal treasure. Even the spear domain ring was far inferior to it in his opinion. Just the amount of cleansing waters it could produce alone was worthy of being the sole ability of a world-changing treasure, but the fact that was just one of its many abilities was shocking. He felt it was best to hide as much of what it could do from the masses. Until now, he only revealed that it could help him mass-produce simple crafts and it contained pods that could help people recover quickly. These weren't quite enough to shock people entirely just yet. The fact he could use the vial instead was a huge positive. But now Lionel was thinking of something else. If the rain beasts consumed a large amount of cleansing waters instead of regular water, how would it change their anatomy? What about their abilities? Lionel's gaze narrowed. Cleansing waters as an attack method. He was used to cleansing waters by now, but he had remembered a time that soaking in cleansing waters of the sixth dimension had been exceptionally painful as it forcefully expelled the impurities in his body. He wondered. As he thought, Lionel moved. Taking out the familiar crystalline vial, he began to toss the rain beasts in one after another. After he solidified his hypotheses, he consulted Aina for a moment, and they came up with a plan that they felt might work. After that, Lionel vanished into the segmented cube to finish up some experiments. He stepped out again just an hour later, prepared to move forward. I think you should take a look at there were no preparations left to make. He was once again at a point where his taking time for accumulation would instead make him fall behind instead. It was time to press forward and take the final leap of fate. He would have to. But compared to the last time he made this choice, he had a confident smirk hanging from his lips. It didn't seem nearly as difficult this time around. However, what Lionel didn't expect was that just as he was about to set out, with everyone prepared and well rested, He would instead have to snap his head in a particular direction. Standing on his city walls, there was an unexpected character. He had very clearly used a treasure to appear so suddenly and soundlessly, so much so that his eyes flickered with surprise when he realized that Lionel had already noticed his arrival. It was clear that this person had expected to wait at least several seconds, but he had actually been discovered immediately. In fact, if he was correct, Lionel's head was already moving before he had even fully manifested. This person couldn't help but narrow his eyes. He looked around silently for a moment. He actually felt slightly uncomfortable taking his eyes off of Lionel at this moment, but he moved as though this discomfort wasn't in his heart at all. With a calm gaze, he scanned over the city, but the more he looked, the more it couldn't help but narrow. Nothing he was seeing seemed to make much sense. Lionel had only about 20,000 subordinates? Were the rest elsewhere? Or was it that he had been caught with his pants down? It couldn't be that this was really all he had, right? But then again, now that he thought about it, this was already the final territory of Adderworth's that he had come to check, and this was the only one with anyone in it. Something was off about this. Finally, after several seconds, this man finally looked back toward Lionel with calm eyes, only to find that the latter had an amused light hidden within. He didn't seem to take his appearance very seriously at all. It was a confident glance, almost as though he could see through him with absolute ease. Lionel stood very calmly despite who this individual was. He hadn't expected for the meeting to be so sudden and unexpected, but it also wasn't enough to shock him to the point of being unable to react. At the same time, he didn't seem to have any intention of attacking immediately either, calmly allowing the other observer the state of the city, as though he couldn't be bothered to care what he did or didn't find out. This man was none other than the only Nova Lionel had yet to meet face to face. Third Nova, Zavnik Morales. Chapter 2071. Published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 2071. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The two final Novas looked toward one another calmly, one's expression unreadable, and the other's smiling. Zavnik was quite handsome and tall. He had slightly paler skin than most Morales, but not to the extent of second Nova. He still carried that familiar bronzed hue. It just wasn't as forceful as the bit of coloration had its edge taken off. His eyes were a gentle brown color and his hair was slightly stiff, though well styled. His robes were meticulously cared for, and he seemed to prefer darker colors. This was a man who dared to negotiate with an expert like Rosen Suyard, a leader of the Senate, while he was merely in the sixth dimension. There were clearly no faults to pick in his temperament, nor his boldness. Littlest Nova, Zavnik greeted with a smile, his unreadable expression suddenly becoming amiable. Lionel smiled back. Despite the fact he was looking up at Zavnik from the ground while the latter was on the city walls, one didn't feel that this was the case at all. It rather felt as though they were both on even ground, looking into each other's eyes. The height difference, the distance between them, and even the fact they stood on opposing sides didn't seem to create any sort of division between them. Third Nova. Zavnik chuckled slightly. I had thought that first Nova would be my greatest challenge. If there was a dark horse, I would have definitely picked fifth Nova. But I didn't expect that it would truly be you. If you hadn't lost 20 years of advantage to us, we really wouldn't stand a chance, HM? Where would the fun in that be? Lionel didn't refute politely, his words all but confirmed that he felt that this was the case as well. But Zavnik didn't feel that this was inappropriate. Over-bloated humility was just as bad in his opinion as underserved arrogance. Your temperament is to my liking. How do you feel about working together? There's only the two of us left and the enemies remaining aren't easy to deal with. There's still the Omen family, the Suyard family and the Spirituals religion. Plus there are still some other stragglers. In order to avoid any issues, I've had a feeling that they'll team up to deal a blow to our Morales family before deciding a winner amongst us. We can't allow that, right? Zavnik expected Lionel to be surprised, or at least take some time to consider, but this wasn't the answer he received at all. Instead, my old man would probably kill me if I used an alliance to win in the final stretch, Lionel said with a laugh. His temper is a weird one. I have a feeling he's watching right now. Well, considering his personality, he's probably pretending to take a nap, but he'll never let me live this down. Velasco, who didn't seem to have been paying much, mumbled beneath his breath. At least he knows not to embarrass me. He felt his wife's glare come from the side, but he pretended as though he hadn't seen it, turning his glasses into an even darker shade as he reclined further. However, Lionel's next words made Velasco almost fall out from his seat. A pity, Zavnik said with a sigh, his gaze flashing with a peculiar light. Lionel laughed. But what I love most to do is piss that old man off. Count me in. The human domain was rendered speechless. Velasco was a character that most of them didn't even dare to look in the eye. Many even believed he was ruthless enough to not bat an eye if his son died. In their opinions, he was probably an extremely strict father that wouldn't allow his son to joke around with, let alone embarrass him like this. But Lionel actually. I think you should take a look at. Eleanor began to giggle, laughing a beautiful laugh that made the hearts of those who heard it flutter. Others might fear Velasco, but in Lionel's opinion, his dad was just a bastard who loved to think himself a comedian and a prankster. If he could get back at this old man, he'd take every opportunity. Velasco coughed, fixing his chair and stabilizing himself. This brat, he was going to ruin all the prestige he had taken decades to build up. What the hell was this? Seeing Velasco trying to maintain his composure, Eleanor's laughter only grew. Zavnik, too, was surprised. A hint of doubt couldn't help but grow in his heart. Clearly, he felt the same about Velasco as everyone else. How could he know that the only suffering Lionel had had at Velasco's hands were prank voicemails? Is that so? That's good, excellent. Zavnik's face lit up. How would you like to cooperate? Lionel asked with a smile. There were all too many methods. Lionel himself had already thought of many, but he didn't state them out. He seemed to want to know more about Zavnik's thought processes. Neither of them knew one another very well, so this sort of simple probe was only a given. About this. Are these all the subordinates you have, little Nova? Lionel shook his head, causing Zavnik to relax slightly. But it was clear he wasn't relaxing due to the fact Lionel would be of more help with more subordinates. Rather, he relaxed because the fact Lionel admitted this so readily meant that there was a hint of trust here. I have an army of another 1,000,000 or so, but they're beasts that can only be used in the waters. They're stingrays. In addition to this, I have about 200,000 or so land beasts, the strongest of which have the strength of Tier 6, and the weakest of which is at Tier 3. But since their strengths have been forcefully raised to this stage, their actual power is limited. Other than this, I have a secret powerful force of about a few hundred. They're all members of the Cloud race and have exceptional combat prowess. Lionel laid out all his cards as though he didn't have a care in the world. No one seemed to know his thoughts. Even Second Nova, who knew Third Nova's true colors, couldn't help but pale. Had he made a mistake by not telling Lionel the truth? Chapter 2072. Published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 2072. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik's heart jumped. When he heard mention of the Cloud race, the odd light in his eyes couldn't be hidden in the slightest. If he had any doubt, it was hard to retain it now. The existence of the Cloud race was too easy to hide. Lionel could have easily hidden them amidst his people without a word, and Zavnik would never know. The appearance of the Cloud race wasn't a small matter. Although there were, of course, weaker and stronger members of every race. Usually, the strength of other races was far more consistent than that of humans. Having the Cloud race on one side was like having a guaranteed floor of strength on your side. The weakest humans were absolutely no match for the weakest of Cloud race members. This was a well-known fact. But the true hidden danger here was whether or not Lionel had managed to get his hands on any powerful members. The likelihood in Zavnik's opinion was very low. However, he had some information on hand that made him not place the probability at 0%. And that was the information he had on Lionel's very first interaction with the Cloud race. He had been able to easily point them out when others hadn't been able to, That was definitely an eyebrow-raising matter. Considering Lionel had dominion over Earth, Zavnik didn't believe that there were no cloud race members targeting the only eighth-dimensional potential world in the human domain. In that case, it might even be true that Lionel had gained the ability to see through cloud race members by first observing cloud race members that had been exposed on Earth itself. In that case, the odds that Lionel might have an extremely powerful member of the cloud race on his side wasn't 0%, nor was it too low. It might even be as high as 30% or even 40%. The more Zavnik thought about it, the more serious he became, but Lionel's smile was just the same. He looked naïve and innocent, but could a naïve and innocent individual control the cloud race under his charge? Could they become the greatest example of a dark horse in Air Wars history? Could they be the one to defeat the enemy that Third Nova thought he would have to struggle the most against? In Zavnik's opinion, Sixth Nova had been too young. Fifth Nova was a wild card and a potential pitfall, but if he took caution, things would be fine. Fourth Nova was a playboy who had taken far too long to take things seriously, and even then he had only begun to take things seriously because he had accidentally gotten his longtime fling pregnant, leading to a whole host of pressure, especially because they were both still within the Void Palace when it happened. As for Second Nova, he had never taken him seriously because although he was clever, he was too used to being a lone wolf. He didn't know how to rely on others, and even when it came to his wide information network, he micromanaged everything he could. One of the most important characteristics of a leader was knowing when to release the reins, and Second Nova thought he could do everything on his own. Knowing all of this, Zavnik had slotted First Nova in as his greatest enemy. He both had great combat prowess and was extremely intelligent, not to mention extremely charismatic as a leader. But somehow, before he even got the chance to lift a finger, this supposed top-tier enemy of his had been eliminated by someone else, and he wasn't even sure how it had happened. Now Seventh Nova, the one that he had given the least regard to, was smiling an unreadable expression toward him, leaving him without the words to respond. After a long while, Zavnik slowly nodded. Little Nova, you've truly been too honest. It feels a little burdensome. I think you should take a look at Lionel's smile didn't fade. If I am too on guard against you, how can we work together properly? We don't have much time. How about you tell me what you have in mind? Right. Little Nova's numbers are smaller than expected, so I assume that you've used your mind to achieve the standards you have today. I wouldn't be surprised if you have many ideas far better than my own. I'll tell you my plans and you tell me how you feel about them. How about it? No problem, Lionel nodded. Zavnik smiled. As I see things, our greatest threat is the Omen family. They have been focused on crafting for several weeks now, and it's hard to tell what their plans are because as more time passes, they spend less and less time clashing with others. At the same time, the biggest wildcard is likely to be the spiritual faith. Even with all of this being the case, I don't believe that attacking either one of them directly is a smart idea. I believe it's best that we act to take out the Seward family first. You and Amory have quite the history. After seeing you, I think this plan will work far better with you than it would have with First Nova. If you challenge him to a one-on-one battle, I don't believe that he wouldn't accept, if for no other reason than to regain his lost pride. I have a treasure here that I've gained from an air-grade dungeon. It's able to release a force-eating poison. If it's released at an opportune moment, then whether it's his sword force or other forces, Amory will find them all to be useless. He will either be forced to use his badge to escape or die. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Why haven't you used this yourself just yet? Well, for one, aside from what I've said about it likely working best with you, I only have one such treasure, and I've had to be cautious with it. In addition, while you're doing this, there'll be a great opportunity. Occasionally missing content. Please report errors in time. Chapter 2073. Published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 2073. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Oh, an opportunity? Yes. You may or may not know, but the spiritual religion and the Seward have attached themselves together, much like us. The difference being that it's a marriage alliance between the current heir of the spiritual's religion and the sword deity. They made a show of fighting one another, resulting in many lowering their guards. The original assumption was that they would be a check and balance on one another, but the moment they became allies, this check and balance vanished, leading to their combined territory not only be the largest with the most plentiful resources, but they also have a very defendable land with no, so-called, natural predators. Lionel's brows raised and he nodded, gesturing for Zavnik to continue. While you're challenging the Suyard, it'll be more convenient for me to target the spiritual's religion directly. This is the best way to separate the two and not allow them to take advantage of fusing their abilities into one, which will be too troublesome for any one of us to handle. Setting aside the sword deity's combat prowess, the heir of the spiritual's religion is exceptionally powerful as well. You may or may not know this, but she is the current #1 in our generation's Queen Beauty rankings. This isn't just because she's an exceptional beauty, but it is also because of her exceptional combat prowess. Of course, the greatest issue with all of this is that no one knows the true limit of her strength. The spiritual's religion do not often associate themselves with conflict, and because they're so powerful no one comes to find trouble with them either. In addition, their heirs or heiresses have never entered the Void Palace. It could be said that the fact she made her way onto the rankings at all, let alone #1, just goes to show you her extraordinary strength. Lionel raised an eyebrow. #1 on the Queen Beauty rankings? Who decided that nonsense? I see. So I'll attack the Suyard half of the territory, while you deal with the spiritual's half. Even if you don't succeed, we'll at least be able to deal with Amory and stop him from receiving reinforcements from the spiritual's religion. This makes sense. It was a simple plan, but often these were the best. With a limited number of moving parts, it would be exceptionally easy to execute, and it would be a simple matter to get in and get out. So you've agreed? Zavnik asked with a smile. Of course, no problem at all. Just give me the time. I was planning on moving out right this moment anyway. I'm ready to go. Zavnik's gaze lit up. Excellent. I will attack exactly 3 hours from now. That is when you can issue your challenge. Noted. Lionel watched with a smile as Zavnik flickered and vanished. Soon, there was nothing but the light breeze of the salted ocean brushing against his ears. The smell in the air was quite strong, but Lionel felt that it was quite good. He looked to the side to find that Aina had appeared by his side. Their conversation wasn't hidden in the slightest, which was actually quite odd for such a complicated affair. Usually, in order to hide such matters from the ears of spies just in case, such things would happen behind closed doors. But both Lionel and Zavnik had sealed the deal on such a thing out in the open. Is it all right to do this? Aina asked. She had found out a lot about what was happening during her mini-vacation with Lionel. While they had been in their own little world, it didn't mean that they hadn't discussed any business whatsoever. So she was fully aware of Lionel's speculations about Third Nova. Toward her question though, Lionel laughed. All right? Well, I guess that would be up to him. It doesn't really matter either way. I think you should take a look at Aina's gaze flickered. And then she pinched Lionel's waist, an action to which he pretended to be quite hurt by. Yelping and running away without the hint of the seriousness a leader should have. Aina could only roll her eyes. Clearly, this man didn't want to explain things. Zavnik appeared in his territory once again, a pensive expression on his face. With a step, he entered his city's core, his contemplation growing deeper and deeper as he slowly sat on his throne. As though on cue, a man strode in with heavy steps. This man was clad in deep green armor, so deep, in fact, that it almost appeared to be black beneath dimmer lights. His hair was an ocean of black, as were his eyes. He looked quite average, but there was something about his demeanor and the depths of his eyes that felt off. Ismson, Zavnik suddenly said without looking up from his thoughts. Yes. The green-armored man replied with a booming voice. Kill these people. Zavnik waved a hand, and a list unfurled. Upon it there was a large list of individuals, thousands of them in fact. Zavnik seemed to have manifested them from the air. Do it appropriately. Form up a troop consisting of them. March them off toward the ocean under the pretext of dungeon hunting. And make sure none of them ever resurface. Isomson's gaze flickered. He didn't quite understand why Zavnik was asking for this. That was because if these people could be called to form a troop, and then march off on Zavnik's orders, weren't their identities obvious? Zavnik was actually executing his own subordinates without the slightest hesitation. Seemingly sensing that Isomson hadn't moved to act on his words immediately, Zavnik looked up. His expression was unreadable, but Isomson couldn't help but shudder, his shoulders visibly trembling. Right away, Lord. Zavnik didn't say a word as Isomson vanished, his fingers tapping on the armrest of his throne. Suddenly, his shadow seemed to shift beneath his feet, but he didn't seem to react to it even as it took the shape of a willowy woman. How ruthless, she said with a giggle. It has to be done. There may very well be Cloud Race members right under our noses, Zavnik replied indifferently. Chapter 2074. Published at 11th of August, 2023, 11:02 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 2074. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The willowy shadow paused. It was clear that this was the very last thing that she had expected to hear. What would the Cloud Race be doing here? And worst yet, why would they be interfering in their plans? She suddenly thought of the worst possibility, and she couldn't help but tremble a bit. I don't think that the situation is that bad, Zavnik said. These Cloud Race members come from the Prince of Earth. The shadow jumped again, before she seemed to piece together the same things that Zavnik had slowly come to understand while he listened to Lionel's words. But what baffled the shadow was why Zavnik would know this. It couldn't be. He just directly told me. That littlest cousin of mine is not simple. He knows well that him informing me that he has Cloud Race members under his charge doesn't lessen my worries. In fact, it increases them. Look at him. He didn't even have to lift a finger, and yet I've directly executed 10,000 of my men for him. He has such a charming smile and glistening eyes, and yet his heart is no less cruel than anyone I've ever met. The shadow paused for a moment before giggling. Keep talking like that and he'll start getting jealous. Don't tell me you'll fall for your own cousin when you have me? Zavnik seemed to be very used to this shadow and her antics, but at the same time he wasn't in the mood to play around. His thoughts were running a million miles a minute. Even as he spoke, he was trying to figure out what to do from here. Sensing this as well, the shadow's voice changed, and she became more serious. Tell me exactly what happened. Zavnik almost carelessly explained things in the most direct way possible. His contact with Lionel was brief to begin with, so there wasn't much to explain. I see. Indeed, this littlest Nova isn't a simple character. Not only did he tell you so much, he didn't even ask you to reciprocate. It's as though he couldn't be bothered to care. Or he knows everything he needs to know already, Zavnik said lightly. The shadow fell silent. Indeed, if Cloud Race members had already infiltrated, what could there be that Lionel didn't know? In fact, it would be an exaggeration to say that Lionel might know even more than Zavnik himself did. How could a leader know every little thing his subordinates did? There might very well be some who were dissatisfied with his orders, some holding grudges from the death of their loved ones. And these would all be things that Lionel would have access to that others wouldn't dare to tell him for the sake of retribution. Just by being honest, Lionel had actually painted Zavnik into a corner he didn't know how to advance from and couldn't retreat from. Is there a chance he's lying just to mess with you? Unlikely. Given his displays in the past, and the precarious situation of Earth, the odds that he really has Cloud Race members are quite high. The real question is how powerful they are. Then how do you plan on moving forward? This isn't something that we can allow to go freely. If we're too lax, victory will slip from us. What do you suggest? I think you should take a look at the shadow. Laughed a seductive laugh. If it was up to me, we would take the most direct approach. As I see it, he's managed to reach this stage likely using his mind over his brawn. There are potentially powerful Cloud Race members protecting him, but if you take an elite squadron with you, I don't believe you would lose. In addition, you did well giving him that air-grade reward. He'll never be ready for the poison now, and he might even foolishly try to use it on you, leaving him in a precarious position. Zavnik thought for a moment, then shook his head. The eyes of Lionel weren't those of someone who was simple to handle. He wouldn't be handled with brute force directly, at least not without revealing his true face. But he wouldn't do that unless it was the final hope he had. The shadow laughed unbothered. You never listen to me anyway, but you always ask. This is just you trying to make me feel like I'm more than just a bed buddy, huh? Am wise to your games. Zavnik didn't move for an entire hour, nor did he respond to the shadow's attempts at seducing him. Then, when there were just 2 hours left to his and Lionel's meeting, his gaze suddenly glowed with a fiercely bright light. Oh, my hubby has a plan? Tell me, tell me. I'm certain of Lionel's final trump card. The pious family. No one would ever guess that a constellation family would divert their resources at the final moment. And especially not to the one young man so many of them want to kill. It seems that Lionel's charm is even greater than that of Adderworth's. The pious family's position was a bit unique. They had a portion of Sixth Nova's old territory, and it had to be remembered that Sixth Nova was once sandwiched between the Omen and Spiritual's religion. If Zavnik attacked the Spiritual's religion normally, and then tried to retreat back to his territory after all was said and done, who would be waiting for him right as he was in his most vulnerable position? The worst part was that after passing through the pious, there would still be the Omen lingering, and with just a bit of prodding from Lionel, they might jump to capitalize on the situation well. Of course, this wasn't what Zavnik had spent an entire hour figuring out. I know what we'll do, he said lightly, standing to his feet. As though on cue, Isomson came rushing in from the outside. Prepare the troops, Isomson. We are moving out now. Zavnik strode forward, his gait confident. Chapter 2075. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:33 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 2075. I'm sorry if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel sat atop of a lion beast from the Leo family. Their size wasn't all the substantial, especially not compared to what he had seen in the Cataclysm Zone, but it was still more than substantial enough for 3 or even 4 people to be seated upon it, and definitely large enough for him to be able to take Aina with him so that he wouldn't be bored on the journey. Aina could only be speechless. The Lionel of the last few months, and this Lionel were far too different. She couldn't even count the number of times Lionel had smiled in the last few months, because it had basically never happened. Now he was in the mood to tease her all the time. It made it all the more embarrassing that she knew that his parents were likely watching, and probably even her father. The projections went all across the human domain, so even if they weren't physically present, it would only take a little effort to watch. Knowing this, she felt a bit embarrassed about what had happened before. She had actually kissed him in front of so many people, and now he wouldn't leave her alone. Aina suddenly pinched Lionel's thigh fiercely, causing him to yelp. This time, Lionel didn't have to fake it. This woman truly had a strong enough grip. This time, it was Lionel's turn to be speechless. What had he done this time? He couldn't even tease his wife? Where was the humanity? In the end, he could only pout. Be obedient. Be serious. Look at them. How can you lead people like this? The various soldiers were doing their best to hold back their laughter. Did they look down on the current Lionel? Of course not. The Skies family only knew the smiling Lionel to begin with. He had crushed their family's patriarch while hardly lifting a finger. As for the Oryx, they knew Lionel from before he even had the conviction to become king in the first place. All that Lionel knew how to do was goof around. After so many tense weeks, watching this scene made a weight on their chests lower. Because Lionel was always so perfect, everyone around him had the pressure to be perfect as well. Since Lionel never made mistakes, they couldn't make mistakes. Since even their leader was always working so hard, how could they be the ones to slack off? Lionel had never been cruel, and his demands had never been excessive, but that only made the burden the rest of them carried even heavier. No one wanted to be the one who disappointed Lionel. Even though they still had such feelings now, for some reason it didn't feel as burdensome. The relaxed Lionel gave off the illusion that everything would be fine. Even if they made 1 or 2 mistakes here and there, he would be there to cover for them. Even while marching into enemy territory like this, he was still in the mood to have fun. The respect they had for Aina was no less deep. While others had only just learned of Aina's skills, that was only because they had only just begun paying attention. All of them had already been beneficiaries of Aina's skill, and they were quite aware of battle plans that Lionel had in place that no one in the outside world was yet privy to, so they were all well aware of how much of it was contingent on Aina. So seeing her reprimand Lionel like this, they felt like laughing in their hearts. Neither of them was inferior to the other. This was how things should be. The Oryx had grown used to following the Oryx King, and the Sky's family had obviously grown used to their own form of governance. But after just a few months with Lionel, they couldn't help but think that it would be so bad to follow such a king and queen. I think you should take a look at smiles bloomed on their faces as they watched Lionel apologize like a wronged child. The ground rumbled, an army moving forward like a swiftly shifting tide. They were akin to a sea of dark green, crushing the greenery in their path as though they couldn't be bothered to march around it. In the territory of the pious family, they had on solemn expressions. They knew that this moment would be coming soon, but they hadn't expected that the sea of people would be this great. They had already known that Zavnik had the largest armies, but it was only now that they were seeing it themselves that they knew how truly exaggerated it was. Zavnik's army, or at the very least the one marching toward them, was easily numbering at 100 million. This sort of monstrous number was enough to build its own air-grade upgrade challenge, but now it was coming toward their city. If they had the strength to challenge the air-grade, they would have done it already. Within the core of the city, Simona's brows furrowed. This wasn't a part of the plan. According to her original thoughts, the fact they had survived to this point likely meant that they would make it to the end point. Given their special characteristics and ability to use poison, not to mention their numbers, anyone targeting them would be sure to suffer greatly. No one in the end game would be willing to take them on until the very final moment. Or so she had thought. But now, Zavnik's armies were rushing toward her, and clearly willing to go all out. Simona sighed and came to an understanding. Zavnik definitely wanted to attack the Suyard and Spiritual Religion Alliance, but was afraid of their taking advantage of the situation. So he wanted to take them out first regardless of the cost. At the very least, even if things went poorly, he still had a lane of retreat back to his own territory. Simona's expression became a bit bitter. They had made it so far just to make a mistake at this step. I'm sorry, Lionel, looks like things won't work out. Indeed. It seemed that Zavnik's conjecture had been correct. Chapter 2076. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:33 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 2076. Returned if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Simona took a breath and stood to her feet. She had indeed promised to side with Lionel. Very few would understand why she would do such a thing, or more importantly, why it was that her family seemed to be all right with it. Simona was the most talented junior born to the pious family in an extremely long time. But what many didn't know was that her status in her paternal clan was even more important. This was an extremely odd matter, and also one that very few knew about. That was because it was far too unconventional, and her Godlen family, her father's family, was far too reclusive. They tended toward nature, so aside from worshipping their god and raising their beasts, they didn't interfere with any matters, much less the politics of the human world. If not to avoid the spotlight being placed on them, Simona would have never been sent to the Void Palace in the first place. This might sound odd. After all, if you wanted to avoid detection, why do the opposite of that by sending such a genius to be placed upon the Queen Beauty rankings? However, it was precisely because of this clever maneuvering of public opinion that the Godlen family was able to keep themselves separate from worldly affairs by not allowing others to talk to them. The fact that the matriarch of the pious family had married the nameless man of an unknown family would have been shocking news enough. However, if the child between them was also under the rules and regulations of his nameless family as well, this would go from a cute love story where the underdog gained victory to something many speculated about. The weight of marriage alliances was quite heavy. This was seen by the fact that even the likes of Amory and the Spiritual Religion heiress could be married off for the sake of their families. The idea of Simona's mother marrying a man without a hint of reputation was entirely unheard of. It had to be known that as someone that could become the matriarch of a constellation family, Matriarch Pius was no normal woman. She too had once been on the Queen Beauty rankings, and outside of Cynthia, there was rarely anyone else of her generation that could match up to her. Due to all of this, after Simona was born, in order to avoid the speculation of the public, her outward face was that of a genius of the Pius family, with her father's family being of secondary concern. In fact, even her last name wasn't Godlen, but rather Pius. It painted the image that Simona's mother had managed to pick her love, but in order to compromise with her family, her daughter's future, along with any other children she might have, were under the control of the Pius family. But the reality was very far from this. In fact, it might be more accurate to say that the Pius family was quite subordinate to the Godlen family, and her parents had not a single ounce of strain between the two of them. When she visited the Godlen family, she was even referred to as Mistress Godlen. There was definitely no fear on the Godlen family's part about offending the Pius family. I think you should take a look at so why was all of this important? It all went back to Simona's little purple puppy. As a member of the Godlen and Pius family, she was actually born with 2 lineage factors, not 1. This was exceptionally rare, as one understood. The Morales family had billions of novas in this generation, but only 7 had been born with 2 lineage factors. The Suyard family was likewise in this situation, but there were only 4 in their current generation, and one of them was Amory. However, this wasn't the important part. What was important wasn't Simona's raw talent, but rather what kind of talent it was. The Godlen's lineage factor was known as the natural beast lineage factor. When a woman gave birth to a seed of the Godlen family, she would actually give birth to 2 things. The first was their child, and the second was known as the natural beast core, an existence that looked very much like an egg. Setting aside the oddity of a human woman birthing an egg, this egg could be considered to be the most important existence to the life of a Godlen family child. That was because one's talent was split between themselves and this creature, and this creature was also the outlet through which all of the Godlen's family's strength was produced. One could see through the talent of a child easily by testing this egg. However, for Simona, this hadn't even been necessary. That was because the instant she and her beast companion were born, the phenomena that was triggered was the likes of which the Godlen family had never seen. And if the Godlen family had been aware, the only phenomena that could have possibly matched up was Lionel's own, and the birth of his Scarlet Star Force innate node. That was the level Simona was at. Unfortunately, the more talented you were as a Godlen family member, the more time it took for your beast companion to grow. And while your beast companion had yet to mature, not only could you not use the Godlen's family's strength, but your improvement speed was only a fraction of what it could be, because more than 90% would be diverted to your companion. The moment she was born, Simona was already slated to be the next leader of the Godlen family. In fact, she matched up with the prophecy of their ancient teachings. With her appearance, the Godlen family would finally be allowed to come out of seclusion, establishing their might and saving the human domain from their calamity. However, due to the schemes of Zavnik and Rosen, Simona had been separated from her beast companion during the teleportation to the Rapak's nest. This had cut off all her potential and crumbled the hope of the Godlen family, until Lionel suddenly returned it. Chapter 2077. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:33 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 2077. Small world. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. When Simona lost her puppy, it was akin to her losing almost 90% of her talent, and cutting off the future hope of the Godlen family. No matter how great their conviction, how could a population of people be willing to stay in seclusion forever? At the same time, how could Simona be willing to never reach her full potential? There was simply no replacement for her beast companion. It had quite literally been born with her. It was like an extension of her limb. This is why she had shed tears when Lionel returned it. After 20 years of despair, Hearing the praises of people while knowing that she could be so much better. She finally saw the light of hope that she had prayed for so long. What she was even more thankful for was Lionel's restraint. That puppy wasn't just a benign little creature, it was also an endless bundle of energy. It had carried over 90% of her energy until this moment. Every time she took one step forward, it would take almost 10. On top of this, it was the purest form of absorbable force as well. There was a reason that the Godlen family had been forced into seclusion long ago. A story that had been wiped from the annals of human domain history. Their beast companions were just extensions of their lineage factors, and were more valuable than even pure force crystals. Their beast companions could quite literally be used as resource wells. To put this matter into proper perspective, the immature beast companion of back then, the very one Simona had lost, could be used to produce dozens of conventional path 7th-dimensional existences. It could even be used at a crucial point to push one to the 8th dimension of the conventional path, something that was extraordinarily rare. She didn't believe that Lionel could sense this, but she also wasn't surprised. Lionel was a man who had turned down the Shadow Sovereign lineage factor because he could stand to kill an unborn Rapax. Many would see such Rapax as nothing more than enemies of another race, unable to humanize them in any way because they simply looked too foreign. But not him. Simona didn't know Lionel very intimately, but she knew enough about him to be willing to follow him wholeheartedly. It was just a shame that at the final moment, she wasn't able to be as useful as she had initially hoped to be. Growling, a little puppy growled by Simona's feet, causing her furrowed brows to unwrinkle into the hint of a smile. By now, the little puppy had finally begun to show some signs of growth, and was about 20% larger than Lionel remembered. Although she had lost 20 years, because she was so much more powerful now, Simona could help the little one to grow a lot faster. Before, it had taken over 20 years for it to reach the stage of being able to walk around on its own. But now, after only just a year or so of having returned to her size, it had grown by 20%. At this pace, it would reach maturity in just another decade or so. Given the fact the more talented she was, the more time it would take, this speed was actually exceptional. Originally, her companion wouldn't have reached maturity until she became an ancestor-level character. And even then it wasn't entirely certain. It seemed that being forced to find a path without this little guy for so long had definitely helped her in many ways. Come on, little guy. Although we aren't allowed to display too much of our strength, I don't believe that we can't make a dent in this army. The little puppy barked with a menacing glare in its eyes, but Simona only laughed more heartily. The little guy didn't sound very menacing at all. I think you should take a look at those who knew Simona would truly be shocked right now. How could they have ever seen this ice beauty laugh like this? Simona turned and strolled forward. The more she walked, the more her laughing expression faded. By the time she walked out from the hall, her expression was icy, her purple hair dancing in the wind. Young Mississippi, a powerful voice came from the side. A young man standing atop a black line with flickering black flames for a mane appeared. The beast seemed to be both illusory and corporeal. Despite the fact the rumbling of the ground had already reached this point, and the buildings were quaking, whether it was the beast or the young man, both were entirely indifferent. With the current state of things, we will lose, the young man said indifferently. They were limited in the strength they were allowed to display. In this regard, they were a lot like the Umbra family. So the moment they saw the state of this, they knew there was nothing they could do. The question was whether or not Simona wanted them to continue to fight to put up a FAA sectionade, or to retreat right this moment. We will fight, Simona said lightly. The young man didn't show any dissatisfaction or pleasure, he only nodded once. Yes, young Mississippi. The rumbling came to a stop just half a kilometer from the gates of the Pius family territory. Seated in the middle of the army, Zavnik watched on with silence as Ismason took a step forward. We will give you all a choice out of respect for the Pius family. Heiress Simona may choose to crush her badge now, and we will make no attempts to stop her. If you refuse, we will attack with full force. Ismason had hardly finished when the thunderous roar of countless beasts echoed. Simona's gaze flickered as another army came into view from the distance. Seated in the middle of his army, Zavnik's gaze couldn't help but narrow. It couldn't be? At that moment, Lionel rode over from the distance with his arms still wrapped around Anna's waist. He didn't seem to be taking this very seriously at all. "Ah, third nova," Lionel said with surprise. "I didn't expect that you and I would actually have the same idea. What a small world." Chapter 2078. Published at 30th of August, 2023. 12:33 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 2078. Or, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The army was small. Compared to Zavnik's numbers in the upwards of 9 figures, the barely few 100,000 that Lionel had come with was truly too pitiful, especially when among that number, most were just wild beasts and only about 20,000 or so were actual humanoids. It didn't make sense to take this matter so seriously. And yet, Zavnik's pause was long and his thoughts came slow. He seemed to lag, not knowing exactly what to make of this immediately. When Lionel said that he had had the same idea, could it be that he wanted to deal with the pious family before he went forward to attack the Seared and Spiritual Religion Alliance? Technically, Lionel was just as vulnerable from the back as Zavnik was given the relative positions of everything, so could it be that his deduction was wrong? In addition, Zavnik had indeed suddenly come up with many allies that others couldn't have expected. He had the largest numbers precisely because of this. So Lionel believing that he might have the pious family in his back pocket wasn't an impossible leap to make. As for Zavnik himself, the reason he had concluded that Lionel must have the pious family by his side was because of those matters that happened over a year ago. Back then, Lionel hadn't done much to hide the fact that he returned Simona's beast companion. In addition, Simona had very publicly stated that her paternal family would be willing to help Lionel out. Back then, it was still a taboo for the Constellation families to take part in the air wars, so it wasn't a matter that many thought about, especially since the Godlen family was relatively unknown. However, given his unique standing, Zavnik was able to put together many oddities about the Godlen family that made him pay a little bit more attention to them. Unfortunately for him, there wasn't anything that he could find in the end that was worth paying any more attention to, so he had forgotten about this matter, until he thought through the methods by which Lionel could have used to deal with him. But now seeing Lionel here, he really had no idea whether he was here to help or attack him. This sort of confusion left Zavnik feeling as though he had just short-circuited. It was too difficult to draw a conclusion, and right now, depending on how he reacted, he could make things either easier or more difficult on Lionel. And yet, at the same time, no matter what path he took, no step was perfect for him. On the one hand, there was potentially offending an ally who was more than willing to work with him ahead of a timeline that he was comfortable with. On the other hand, there was Lionel and the pious family teaming up with one another to deal with him, and he had actually delivered himself on a silver platter. Looking at Lionel's smiling face, he actually couldn't tell which one it was, and it was actually beginning to agitate him. He had always had everything in the palm of his hands. He was easily forgotten as the third nova. It could even be called middle child syndrome if he wanted to be dramatic about it, but this had also allowed him to fly under the radar, while setting up everything exactly like he wanted it. He had even played with the governing structure of the Void Palace as a mere sixth-dimensional existence, but right now he actually didn't know what to do. Lionel's expression gave nothing away, and the few seconds that were ticking by truly felt like an eternity. The more he tried to find an answer, the further it slipped away from him. It felt like everyone was observing him, waiting to see how he would react. Zavnik's confusion was just the same as everyone else. This was the largest conflict currently taking place in the air wars, so the number paying attention to this location was over 90%. But they couldn't make heads or tails of it either. Suddenly, Zavnik began to laugh. He shook his head. "I think you should take a look at, indeed, it's a funny matter," Zavnik responded to Lionel's words finally. "As they say, great minds think alike. But I'm beginning to feel that your mind and mine aren't exactly the same at all. It seems that we've been quite on guard against one another, so what will you do, Lionel?" Lionel grinned. "Well, that depends. If I help you out, will you kill me like you did your subordinates once you're finished with me?" Zavnik's smile didn't fade, but the downcast over his gaze only grew. I'm not sure what you mean, littlest Nova. You don't? Ah, you really might not, but that's because I forgot to explain something during our first meeting. What you might not know is that the reason no one else can build territories in the ocean is because all 4 seas have already been claimed. Zavnik's pupils constricted, but his expression wasn't too surprising. After all, he knew this already. Everyone was dealing with the very same situation, and they were all wary of one another, wondering which 4 powers had actually managed such a thing. The problem was that there weren't many powers remaining. There were barely over 4 in number to begin with. So who could have done it? The simplest answer is usually the right one, Lionel said with a chuckle. But even when you have that saying in mind, the importance of context is also important. There are only 6 powers remaining. Myself, yourself, the Omen family, the Pious family, the Suyard family, and the Spirituals religion. However, 2 of those powers are in an alliance, and so there's only 5 powers remaining, technically. And you yourself are certain that you don't own a sea, so that means what, exactly? Zavnik suddenly shuddered. It was either all 4 powers remaining aside from himself had claimed a sea, or Lionel grinned. They were all claimed by a single person. You tell me which is the simplest answer. Chapter 2079. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:33 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 2079. Refute? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik felt as though his mind was collapsing. Looking at Lionel's charming smile, his heart was threatening to beat out of his chest. It was, indeed, the simplest answer. It was just one that he wasn't willing to accept. He had the largest number of people, and he had even been the closest to claiming a sea aside from Lionel before Orinik, and the others had been booted out by Lionel's success. What made more sense? That everyone but the one with the largest number of followers had managed to succeed in such a difficult endeavor, or that just one person with a perfect system had managed to do the impossible, and claim the entire ocean for him. When it was laid out like this, the answer was all too obvious, and it wasn't even one that Zavnik could refute. It was then that the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. How had they managed to make it to this point in the conversation? Wasn't it because Lionel was accusing him of killing his subordinates? Of course he had done so, but how could Lionel have any proof of that? But then he remembered. He had sent Ismson to the ocean. Back then, it had just been the obvious choice. The continent had already been cleared of its resources by the rapaciousness of the heirs. The only resources that remained were within the ocean. If he wanted to send a team out on a pretense, the only location he could use was the ocean. But the entire ocean was Lionel's territory. Everything that happened within it, every person who stepped foot within its borders, especially if it was a number as large as within the thousands, would be known by him. Zavnik wanted to speak, but Lionel had already flipped a palm, throwing an orb into the air. At that moment, the images began to speed by one after another. Basically, no one had paid attention to Zavnik sending out his subordinates on a mission to clear dungeons. The fascination with dungeons had long since waned, and the public was far more excited about the coming alliance war between the Morales and the Suyard. Zavnik knew this and had taken advantage of the situation. Although he had spoken Ismson's orders aloud, the reality was that only Ismson himself and the shadow beneath his feet had heard it. He had long since come up with a system to hide his actions perfectly, but it seemed that none of this mattered at the moment. He couldn't even stop Lionel. He could only watch as the actions of Ismson were broadcasted. The slaughter of his subordinates was right before everyone, and no small number of individuals felt their hearts grow cold. Others might not know, but those within Zavnik's army knew all too well. Ismson was Zavnik's right-hand man. Many of the orders they received came from him directly. Even those that weren't familiar with Zavnik's chain of command had watched enough battles to know this. And those that were a little too foolish to pick up on this earlier had quite literally just seen Ismson step forward to give Simona an ultimatum. It was like every step Zavnik took just chained him down further, suffocating him until the point his vision could only go black. He was certain that Lionel had even waited to appear until after Isomson had spoken just so that the connection could be made even easier. He didn't even pause the video, he didn't speed it up, he forced them all to watch as Isomson trapped and killed over 10,000 of Zavnik's subordinates, one after another without pause. Maybe the most eerie part was that Lionel's smile never faded even a single time. His arm remained wrapped around Aina's waist, enjoying her supple skin as though he was still on vacation rather right in the middle of a battlefield. I think you should take a look at suddenly. The video came to an end and silence fell. Oh, it's over, Lionel said lightly, putting the orb away. Zavnik sat in silence. His expression had long since become placid, but a brewing rage was within his heart despite not showing up in the slightest. You put on a nice show for us all, Zavnik said softly. Lionel smiled. I try my best. When you told me that you had so many Cloud Race members on your side, I didn't believe you. But you're quite bold to be willing to kill thousands of them. They would have been very helpful toward your cause. Lionel's smile didn't fade, although he very much understood what Zavnik was trying to say. Clearly he wanted to pretend as though this was all a ruse. Either that, or he wanted everyone to believe that everyone he had ordered Isomson to kill had been a member of the Cloud Race. Me? Controlling the Cloud Race? Where? Lionel blinked innocently. Your imagination is pretty wild, Third Nova. Zavnik clenched his jaw so hard that his teeth almost cracked, a vein surging up his throat and another pulsing across his forehead. Slowly he calmed down. Of course, everyone watching in the human domain knew that Lionel had Cloud Race members, but Zavnik's people didn't know that. In addition, those watching knew that Lionel only had a few hundred Cloud Race members. Where would he get over 10,000 from? His greatest weakness was his small numbers. Lionel was simply too brilliant. Convincing people only required the simplest explanations. Everyone outside knew he had Cloud Race members and could draw the conclusion that he had too few of them. But if he tried to explain this to Zavnik's subordinates, it would take too many words and many wouldn't believe him over Zavnik. So he chose the simplest approach, making Zavnik's explanation look as ridiculous as possible. There was simply nothing Zavnik could say to refute. Like this, he killed two birds with one stone. Everyone in the human domain now knew exactly how vicious Zavnik was, while his subordinates did as well. Would they be able to continue fighting for him? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.